Hello friends of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. It's funny how the military prepares you for just about everything except the things that actually matter. Take 2004, for example. I was on a covert op in the Montana Rockies. Nothing fancy, just basic recon. But deep in the backcountry, things rarely go according to plan. My name's Sergeant Alex Mac McAllister, ex-Green Beret. And at that moment, I was stuck babysitting a team of specialists, a geologist, a zoologist, and a tech guy who looked like he hadn't seen daylight since the Carter administration. Their mission? Investigate some weird seismic activity. My mission? Keep them alive and make sure nobody wandered off. Sounds easy, right? Keep the nerds together, fill out some paperwork, and call it a day. Except things got weird the moment we hit the site. At first, I thought it was all in their heads. They kept babbling about strange readings, wildlife acting crazy, and this pressure in the air, like something big was about to happen. I chalked it up to altitude sickness and paranoia. They didn't laugh. That's when I knew we were in for a rough ride. Now, I've seen some shit in my time, but what we ran into that day, it wasn't in any combat manual. It wasn't the Taliban or some rogue militia. Hell, it wasn't even human. It started with an old, half-collapsed mine shaft hidden in the trees, like nature was trying to swallow it whole. Rusty tracks led inside, and the air coming out of that place was stale, almost rotten. Naturally, the geologist, Dr. Lewis, was all over it. He started jabbering about geological formations and rock strata, stuff that made my eyes glaze over. The others nodded like they understood. I'm pretty sure they didn't. Let's make this quick, I muttered, mostly to myself. I had a bad feeling about this, and I've learned to trust my gut. We moved into the shaft, flashlights cutting through the dust. The air was thick, oppressive, and there was this faint sound, like metal dragging against rock. I immediately thought of the old tracks, maybe something shifting under the earth. But it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. This place hasn't been used in decades, Lewis said, his voice echoing in the shaft, making it sound like there were more of us down there. Strange, the condition it's in. Yeah, strange, I mumbled, tightening my grip on my rifle. That's when we saw it, or rather, when it saw us. The thing wasn't huge, but it moved with the kind of speed that made you wish you'd stayed in bed that morning. It darted between the shadows, and I got just enough of a glimpse to know it wasn't anything natural. It was low to the ground, covered in slick, oily skin, with limbs that were too long for its body. Imagine a wolf, except mangled, twisted, like it had been chewed up and spat out by evolution. Its head, it reminded me of a dog's skull, but without the comfort of flesh. Don't move, I hissed, keeping my voice low. Everyone froze except Lewis, who was fumbling with his camera. Idiot, I thought. Get a load of this, Lewis whispered. his voice trembling with excitement. This could be, He didn't get to finish his sentence. Jones, the tech guy, was yanked into the darkness. 1 second he was there, the next he was gone. We heard the sound of something tearing, a wet, disgusting rip. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was happening to him. And Jones, he wasn't screaming anymore. I took point, slowly backing up the others. But that thing wasn't done with us yet. It lunged again, claws scraping the rock walls. It grabbed Lewis, and before I could react, it had him on the ground, tearing into his chest like it was opening a can of sardines. Blood sprayed everywhere. I've seen plenty of carnage in my time, but the speed, the violence, this was different. I couldn't get a shot off without hitting Lewis, and by the time I had a clear line, there wasn't enough of him left to save. "Run!" I shouted. To their credit, they listened. The remaining three, me, Miller, and the zoologist, a young woman named Parker, hauled ass out of that mine. My legs were burning, lungs screaming for air, but adrenaline has a funny way of keeping you alive. We burst into the daylight, but it didn't feel safe. I could hear the thing behind us moving fast, too fast. I turned, raised my rifle, and unloaded. I hit it. I know I hit it. The rounds tore into its body, but it barely flinched. It staggered, snarled, if you could call it that, then disappeared into the trees. "What the hell is that thing?" Miller gasped, hands on his knees. "Not sure," I said, "but I don't think it's done with us." The thing had retreated, but it wasn't gone. I could feel it watching us. We needed to get out of there fast, but of course nothing is ever simple. The damn radio was fried, probably from whatever electromagnetic nonsense they'd been talking about earlier. No signal, no rescue. We were on our own. We made camp about 2 miles from the mine, up in a small clearing. I thought about staying awake, keeping watch, but I knew deep down that it wouldn't matter. If it wanted us, it would come, and there was nothing I could do about it. We had a flare gun and a few sidearms, hardly enough to take down whatever that thing was. That night, I didn't sleep. Neither did the others, not really. We just sat there, waiting for the inevitable. I thought about cracking a joke, something dark to lighten the mood, but nothing felt right. It's hard to be funny when death is sitting on your doorstep. Around midnight, I heard it again. The dragging sound, metal on stone, closer this time. "Parker," Miller whispered. He had the look of someone who had already accepted he was a dead man walking. "I don't think we're getting out of this," Miller said, his voice low, resigned. "No one dies unless I say so," I replied, even though I didn't believe it myself. Sometimes you just say things because you have to. Keeps morale up. The thing didn't wait long to make its move. It came at us fast, from the tree line. I barely had time to grab my rifle. Parker screamed, but it didn't help her. It grabbed her first, yanking her back into the shadows before I could even take aim. Miller fired his sidearm, but it was like shooting spitballs at a tank. The creature roared. No, not a roar. Something worse. It sounded like tearing metal, like it was laughing at us. fall back," I shouted, pulling Miller to his feet. We ran again, but this time there was no plan, no strategy, just blind panic. The thing caught up to us, of course. It was inevitable. It got Miller next, dragged him by the leg, then threw him against a tree so hard I heard his skull crack. I kept running, adrenaline doing the thinking for me. When I reached the edge of the tree line, I turned, rifle raised, ready to face it. But it was gone. I waited, rifle trembling in my hands, breathing hard. Nothing. The woods were silent again, too silent. The next morning, I went back to the camp. Bodies were everywhere, torn apart like rag dolls. No sign of the creature. I don't know if it was toying with me, if it let me live on purpose, but I'm here and they're not. I radioed for extraction, waited for hours. When the chopper arrived, I didn't say much. I didn't need to. They could see it in my eyes. Whatever that thing was, I don't think it was just some mutated animal. No, it was something else. Something this world wasn't supposed to have. And me. I'll never go back to Montana. The strangest part about being a cop in a small town is that you know everyone. But when something goes wrong, it's like you didn't know them at all. This wasn't what I expected when I first started out here in Pine Ridge, Oklahoma, back in '94. My name's Ben Walker, and I've been the town's go-to guy for every little thing, from stray dogs to folks arguing over property lines. I even got called out to investigate some ghostly lights in the graveyard once. You learn to laugh most days, but sometimes you realize that not everything can be brushed aside with a joke. Life was simple in Pine Ridge. I grew up in a town nearby where the biggest excitement was the annual rodeo. Pine Ridge was smaller, quieter. Until last month, I would have sworn it was the safest place on earth. But if you've ever met someone who thought living in a quiet town meant life wasn't dangerous, you've met a fool. It was July 23rd, 1994, when things started to get weird. I was at the station catching up on paperwork when the call came in. A guy named Frank Miller, who ran the local diner, was yelling about his missing wife. Now, Frank's a bit of a hothead, always getting into some kind of trouble. So when I picked up the phone and heard him screaming, I figured it was just another one of their fights. "She's gone, Ben." Frank's voice was cracking. "Mary never came home last night." I glanced at the clock. It was just before 6:00 p.m. That's when I realized something was off. She'd been gone for a full day, and Frank hadn't called until now. He said he'd looked everywhere, asked around, but no one had seen her since she left the diner around 8:00 p.m. the night before. "Did you check by the lake?" I asked. "Maybe she went there to cool off after you two had a spat." No, it ain't like that this time, Ben. You gotta help me." That last bit struck me. Frank didn't ask for help unless he was in deep. I told him I'd head over to his place and take a look around. I wasn't expecting much, honestly. Maybe she'd gone off to the city or was staying at a friend's. People do crazy things when they're upset. But when I got to the Miller's house, Frank was sitting on the porch, shaking like a leaf. "She's not here, Ben. I swear to God, he muttered, his eyes darting all over the place like he was expecting something to jump out at him. You call her family? I asked, stepping up to him. Yeah, they haven't heard from her either. All right, let's check the woods. Maybe she's just cooling off somewhere. We headed behind the house towards the tree line. Pine Ridge is surrounded by thick woods. There are a couple of small clearings, but mostly it's a tangled mess of branches and undergrowth. The kind of place you don't wander into without a good reason. As we walked, I asked Frank more questions. What she was wearing, where she was last seen. He kept giving me the same shaky answers, his hands twitching. After about 15 minutes, we found a path that led deeper into the woods. Frank stopped dead in his tracks, his face going pale. She wouldn't have gone down there, he whispered. Now, I'd heard some dumb things in my time, but this was starting to smell like fear. And fear, especially around here, was never without reason. What's down there? I asked, half joking. You got some kind of boogeyman hiding in the trees? Frank didn't answer. He just stared into the woods like something was watching him. I followed his gaze but didn't see anything out of the ordinary. It was the same old trees, the same old sounds. Frank, get a grip, man, I said, a bit harder than I meant to. We're just looking for your wife. You want to tell me why you're so damn spooked? I don't know, Ben, he muttered. I just got a feeling, a bad one. I snorted. Feelings don't solve problems, Frank. But as soon as I said it, the air changed. I don't know how to describe it. The temperature hadn't dropped, nothing obvious had shifted, but suddenly it felt wrong, like the woods were too quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet. It was an unnatural silence. No birds, no insects, just the two of us standing there listening to our own breathing. All right, I said, pulling my flashlight from my belt. Let's get this over with. Frank didn't argue. He just followed me, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to make himself smaller. We walked the path for another 10 minutes before we found it, a clearing. And in the middle of that clearing was something that made my blood run cold. A shoe, just one. A woman's sneaker lying on its side in the dirt. That hers? I asked, already knowing the answer. Frank nodded, his face as pale as a ghost. I stepped closer, shining the flashlight around. The trees were thick, almost too thick, like they were leaning in on us. There was no sign of a struggle, no footprints other than our own. But the shoe, it was wrong. No tracks, I muttered. But that doesn't make sense. If she dropped it while running, we'd see something. She didn't run, Frank whispered. She was taken. I looked up at him. Taken? By who? I don't know, he stammered, his eyes wide. But I've heard stories about the woods, about something that lives out here, something that takes people. At this point, I wanted to smack him for feeding into some backwoods superstition. But before I could say anything, a rustling sound came from the trees. We both froze. The rustling got louder, like something was moving toward us. Slowly, deliberately, I stood up, my hand instinctively going to the holster on my belt. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is Officer Walker with the Pine Ridge Police Department. Show yourself." Silence. Then, out of nowhere, Frank took off running. The coward bolted back down the path, and for a second I thought about chasing him, but something told me to stay put. The rustling started again, this time from the opposite side of the clearing. It was moving fast, circling me. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was out there, watching, waiting. My heart pounded in my chest, but I held my ground, pulling my gun and holding it steady. "All right," I muttered under my breath. "Come on out." And it did. A flash of movement in the trees. It was quick, like a shadow darting between the trunks. Then another flash, closer this time. My pulse quickened. Whatever it was toying with me. I tightened my grip on the gun, my finger hovering over the trigger. The thing circled again, and this time I caught a glimpse of its form, tall, gangly, with limbs that moved unnaturally fast. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, like it hadn't seen sunlight in decades. But what threw me off the most was the size of it. It was bigger than any man, much bigger, like it had been stretched out and twisted into something no longer human. I'd seen plenty of animals in these woods, bobcats, coyotes, even a black bear once. But this wasn't anything I recognized. It moved with an unnatural grace, and the sound it made, God, the sound. It was like bones cracking in slow motion. I raised the gun higher, aiming into the darkness. "Come on," I said, louder this time. "Show yourself." It obliged. The thing lunged from the shadows, its long arms reaching for me. I fired once, twice, 3 times, but it was too fast. The bullets hit the trees behind it as it closed the distance. I barely had time to react before it was on me, knocking me to the ground with bone-jarring force. I scrambled back, gasping for air, but the creature didn't follow. It just stood over me, its head cocked to the side like it was studying me. I could see its chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, hear the faintest wet sounds. Then, without warning, it turned and bolted back into the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had come. I lay there for a moment, staring up at the sky, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My hand was still clenched around the gun, but my arm was shaking too badly to hold it steady. After a few minutes, I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. Frank was gone, no sign of him or his wife anywhere. I forced myself to my feet, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and started down the path back to Frank's house. My mind raced, trying to process what I'd seen. It wasn't human, that much was obvious, but no animal moved like that either. It was something else, something I'd never seen before, something I couldn't explain. As I got closer to Frank's place, the trees seemed to close in around me, every rustle of leaves sending a chill down my spine. The gun felt heavy in my hand, but I wasn't about to put it away, not until I was back in the light, out of these cursed woods. I broke through the tree line and spotted Frank's house up ahead. The porch light was still on, but Frank was nowhere to be seen. I hurried toward the house, hoping against hope that maybe he'd made it back and was hiding inside. But when I reached the porch, I saw the front door hanging open. "Frank," I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "You in there?" No answer. I stepped inside, gun still drawn, and swept the small living room with my flashlight. It was empty, the kitchen empty. I moved toward the back of the house, dread settling deeper into my bones with every step. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. I nudged it open with the barrel of my gun. The room was dark, but the smell hit me first, metallic, thick like iron. My stomach churned as I shone the light into the room. And that's when I saw him, Frank, or what was left of him. His body was sprawled across the floor, his chest torn open, blood pooling around him in a sickeningly large puddle. But it wasn't just the sight of Frank's mangled corpse that froze me in place. It was the fact that something had been feeding on him. The creature was still there, crouched in the far corner of the room, its long limbs folding and unfolding as it gnawed at what remained of Frank's torso. I could see its pale, twisted form more clearly now, hunched over like some grotesque, elongated spider. For a split second, I thought about firing the gun. My finger twitched on the trigger, but the thing didn't react. It didn't even seem to notice me. I slowly backed out of the room, my heart hammering in my chest. If it hadn't seen me yet, I wasn't about to give it a reason to. Step by step, I made my way down the hallway, praying I wouldn't step on a creaky floorboard or make some noise that would alert the thing to my presence. My breathing was shallow, barely audible, and every inch of my body was screaming for me to run. But I didn't. Not yet. When I reached the front door, I paused, casting one last glance over my shoulder. The creature hadn't moved. It was still feasting on Frank, oblivious to the world around. Part of me wanted to shoot it, to end whatever hellish nightmare this thing had brought to our town. But a bigger part of me knew better. There was no winning against something like that. So I turned and bolted out of the house, my feet hitting the porch steps with a force that rattled my bones. I didn't stop running until I was back in my squad car, parked just down the road. I slammed the door shut, threw the car into drive, and peeled out of there like my life depended on it. And maybe it did. I drove straight to the station, heart still pounding, hands shaking so hard I could barely keep the car on the road. I thought about calling for backup, but what the hell was I supposed to tell them? That some monstrous creature was out in the woods killing people? That it had just torn Frank apart like a piece of meat? No one would believe me. I didn't even believe myself. By the time I got back to the station, I was in a daze. I sat in the car for what felt like hours, staring out into the darkness, my mind replaying everything I'd seen. His wife was still missing, and that thing, whatever it was still out there. But I couldn't just leave it at that. I couldn't just sit there and pretend like this didn't happen. So I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the radio and called it in. "Dispatch, this is Officer Walker. We've got a situation." The response came quickly, static crackling through the speaker. "What's the situation, Walker?" I hesitated for a moment, trying to find the words. "Frank Miller's dead. I found his body at his house. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a confused, "What do you mean, dead? What happened?" I took a deep breath, my mind racing. It wasn't natural. There's something in the woods, something wrong. Another long silence. "Officer Walker, are you requesting backup?" I thought about it, about sending more people into those woods. But what good would that do? If whatever was out there could tear a man apart in seconds, what chance did we have? "Just send someone to secure the scene," I said finally. "I'll be waiting." I hung up the radio and sat there, the weight of everything crashing down on. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but one thing was for sure. Pine Ridge was no longer the quiet, safe town I'd once believed it to be. As I waited for backup to arrive, I kept my eyes on the woods, watching for any sign of movement. I half expected to see that thing again, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. But the trees remained still, and the night air was quiet, too quiet. In the distance, I saw the flashing lights of the incoming squad cars. The cavalry had arrived. But as they pulled up beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all too late. Too late to save Frank. Too late to stop whatever was out there. As the officers approached, I stepped out of my car, nodding grimly at them. "What's going on, Walker?" one of them asked, his face tight with concern. I looked back toward the dark woods behind Frank's house, and then back at them. "You're about to find out," I said, knowing full well they weren't ready, because no one ever is. And with that, Pine Ridge became just another name on the list of towns people forgot. Camping along the Little Toccoa River wasn't exactly my thing, but I was desperate for some peace and quiet. My job at the hardware store wasn't thrilling unless you count the occasional mismatched paint spill. And after a long week, I needed to escape. So, I packed up my gear and drove 2 hours into the foothills of the Appalachians, hoping the river's solitude would clear my head. I'd been coming to this spot since I was a kid. Dad used to bring me here to fish, and we'd spend hours casting lines into the water, talking about everything and nothing. But Dad was gone now, and I hadn't been back since the funeral. The place felt different without him, emptier somehow, but maybe that was just me. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The familiar sounds of the river welcomed me like an old friend. The water was low, revealing the smooth stones beneath the surface, and the trees were showing the first hints of autumn. I set up camp near a bend in the river where the water slowed and formed a deep pool, perfect for fishing. As the sun dipped below the trees, I built a fire and settled in with a can of beans and my fishing pole. The river whispered in the darkness, a constant, soothing presence that lulled me into a sense of security. I hadn't seen another soul since I'd arrived, which was exactly how I liked it. The night was clear, the stars bright against the inky sky, and for a while I just sat there staring into the flames, lost in thought. It wasn't until the fire had burned low that I first heard it, a rustling in the bushes across the river, followed by a faint splash in the water. I looked up, scanning the opposite bank, but saw nothing. Probably just a deer, I told myself, though my gut said otherwise. The rustling continued, moving downstream. The sounds grew fainter as whatever it was moved away from my camp. I stood up, peering into the darkness, but still saw nothing. Just the sound of the river and the trees whispering in the breeze. Shrugging it off, I tossed another log on the fire and settled back into my chair. If it was a deer, it was long gone by now. But the unease lingered, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I cared to admit. The fire burned on, casting flickering shadows that danced across the trees, and I forced myself to relax. There was nothing out there, nothing to be afraid of, or so I thought. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, the fire was nearly out, and the air had grown cold. The sound of the river was still there, but now there was something else, too. A low, steady breathing coming from somewhere close by. Too close. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I listened. The breathing was slow and deliberate, a deep inhalation followed by a long, drawn-out exhale. It was coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned my head, my eyes straining to see in the dim light. At first, I saw nothing, just the trees and the dark outline of the forest. But then a shape began to emerge from the shadows. A figure crouched low to the ground, its body obscured by the darkness. It was huge, easily the size of a bear, but it moved with an eerie grace that sent a chill down my spine. Its limbs were long and sinuous, almost spider-like, and its head was elongated, resembling that of a wolf, but with features that were disturbingly human. It was watching me, its breath visible in the cold night air. And as it stepped into the light of the dying fire, I saw its face, if you could call it that. Its skin was stretched taut over its skull, the bones protruding at unnatural angles, and its mouth was filled with jagged, uneven teeth that seemed too large for its head. It had no eyes, just dark, empty sockets that seemed to suck in the light around them. And as it grinned at me, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I should have run, should have done something, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by a fear unlike anything I'd ever known. The creature tilted its head as if curious, and then, with sudden, horrifying speed, it lunged. I barely had time to react. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet as I scrambled to get away. The creature's claws raked across my leg, tearing through my jeans and into the flesh beneath. I cried out in pain, but the sound only seemed to excite it, and it came at me again, its jaws snapping inches from my face. Somehow, I managed to roll away, grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a thick branch from the fire. I swung it at the creature, the flames licking at its skin, and it let out a screech that echoed through the night. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, and for a moment, I thought I had driven it off. But it wasn't done with me yet. It circled me, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it was toying with me. I kept the branch between us, the firelight casting grotesque shadows across its face. It was smart, too smart, and it seemed to know that I was running out of options. In a final act of desperation, I threw the branch at the creature and ran. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. The forest closed in around me, the trees ablur as I sprinted through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the trees, getting closer with every step. My leg was on fire, the pain nearly unbearable, but I couldn't stop, not now. I burst out of the trees and into a clearing, the river just ahead. I didn't hesitate. I ran straight for the water, hoping that maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't follow me. But it did. I plunged into the river, the cold water shocking me to my core. The current was stronger here, pulling at me as I tried to swim to the other side. I could hear the creature behind me, its claws scraping against the rocks as it tried to keep up. I didn't dare look back. I just kept swimming, my lungs burning, my limbs numb from the cold. The far bank seemed impossibly far, but I pushed on, driven by a primal instinct to survive. Finally, my feet touched the bottom, and I dragged myself out of the water, collapsing on the shore. I was exhausted, soaked to the bone, but I wasn't safe yet. The creature was still coming. I struggled to my feet, every muscle screaming in protest, and looked around desperately for something, anything, I could use to defend myself. My eyes landed on a large, jagged rock, half buried in the sand. I grabbed it, lifting it above my head, just as the creature reached the shore. It hesitated, its empty sockets locked onto me, and for a moment we just stood there, both of us breathing heavily. Then, with a roar, it charged. I brought the rock down with all the strength I had left, smashing it into the creature's skull. It let out a final, agonized screech, its body convulsing as it collapsed to the ground. I didn't wait to see if it was dead. I dropped the rock and ran, not stopping until I was back at my camp. My leg was bleeding badly, and I knew I needed to get help, but adrenaline was the only thing keeping me going. By the time I reached my truck, I could barely walk. I managed to climb inside, slamming the door shut behind me, and drove out of there as fast as I could. The last thing I saw in my rearview mirror was the creature's body lying motionless on the shore, the rock still embedded in its skull. I made it to the hospital, where they stitched me up and asked all the usual questions. I told them I'd been attacked by an animal, a bear maybe, but they didn't believe me. The doctor said the wounds didn't match any animal they knew, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. They released me the next day, and I drove home, determined to forget what had happened. But when I turned on the news that night, there it was, a report of a missing hiker, last seen near the Little Toccoa River. They never found the body. But I knew what had happened. I knew the truth, and that's all that matters. It was 2018, and I was stuck in the middle of nowhere. I mean, nowhere the Tian Shan Mountains of Kyrgyzstan. My name's Wyatt Thompson, but back home in Texas, everyone calls me Slim. Not because I'm some kind of skinny dude, but because I had a knack for getting out of sticky situations. Growing up on a ranch will teach you a thing or two about hard work, quick thinking, and the importance of a good joke, even if my humor's drier than a popcorn fart. Our mission was simple enough, or so we thought. We were there to find and retrieve a recon drone that had gone AWOL. Intel suggested it crashed somewhere near the Sarijaz River Valley, a place so remote you could practically hear the crickets snoring. The higher-ups wanted that drone back before any unwelcome eyes could get their grubby mitts on it. In and out, like grabbing a beer from the fridge. Easy peasy, right? My team consisted of 4 seasoned Green Berets. Miller, the gruff but dependable navigator. Jones, our comms whiz with a fondness for dad jokes. Garcia, the quiet scout who noticed everything. And me, the team leader trying to keep this circus act in line. We were dropped off at the crack of dawn, the chopper blades whipping the cold mountain air as we descended into the wilderness. The scenery was postcard-worthy, with towering snow-capped peaks, valleys blanketed in thick forests, and rivers that shimmered like a freshly waxed truck. But beauty can be deceiving. These mountains were as unforgiving as a drill sergeant with a hangover. We moved with purpose, each step calculated, eyes peeled for any sign of the downed drone. As we trekked deeper, Miller tried to lighten the mood. Why don't scientists trust Adam? He asked, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. Not now, Miller, I muttered, focused on the GPS coordinate, because they make up everything. He finished, chuckling to himself. Jones groaned. That's about as original as a week-old burrito. Despite the banter, a knot of unease settled in my gut. The forest grew denser. The trees gnarled and twisted, like they were whispering secrets we weren't supposed to hear. Garcia suddenly stopped, raising a fist. Tracks, he whispered, but not anything I recognized. I knelt beside him, examining the impressions in the soft earth. They were large, oval-shaped, with 4 distinct claw marks, way too big for a wolf, and bears weren't common in this area. It reminded me of something, but I couldn't quite place it. Maybe it's Bigfoot's Kyrgyz cousin, Jones quipped, adjusting his glasses. Let's keep moving, I said, though a shiver ran down my spine. We pressed on, the daylight fading as a thick fog rolled in, muting the forest's colors into shades of gray. The GPS indicated we were close to the crash site, but visibility was down to a few feet. Anyone else feel like we're walking into a horror movie? Miller whispered. Don't worry, Miller, Jones replied. If things go south, at least we'll be famous. I'll make sure they spell your name right on the memorial. Cut the chatter, I ordered. Focus. Then we saw a glint of metal through the trees. The drone lay crumpled in a small clearing. Its wings snapped like a twig. We approached cautiously, Garcia scanning the perimeter while Miller and I inspected the wreckage. Data cores intact, Miller noted, prying open a panel. We can retrieve the intel. Let's make it quick, I said. I don't want to overstay our welcome. As if on cue, a low rumble echoed through the forest. It wasn't thunder, and it sure as hell wasn't any machine I knew. The ground vibrated slightly, unsettling the loose pebbles at our feet. What was that? Jones asked, his usual sarcasm replaced with genuine concern. Before I could answer, Garcia emerged from the tree line, his face pale. "We have a problem," he stated flatly. He led us to a gruesome sight, a torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch, stained dark red. Beneath it, the ground was disturbed, and a smear of blood led deeper into the wood. "Looks fresh," Garcia said. "Human, maybe. A local hunter?" Miller suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "In this remote area?" Jones shook his head. "Unlike, I weighed our options. Our mission was to retrieve the drone, but leaving without investigating didn't sit right with me. If someone was injured, protocol dictated we offer assistance." "Garcia, take point," I decided. "We'll follow the trail, but stay sharp." We moved cautiously, weapons at the ready. The blood trail led us to a cave entrance, partially concealed by overgrown foliage. A foul odor wafted out, a mix of decay and something else, something prime. "Smells worse than Jones's cooking," Miller tried to joke, but no one laughed. Inside the cave, the walls glistened with moisture, the air thick and damp. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, beams dancing over jagged rock. Then we saw them bones scattered across the cavern floor, picked clean. Some were animal, but others were unmistakably human. Skulls stared back at us with empty sockets, a silent testimony to unspeakable act. "Dear God," Jones whispered, swallowing hard. A sudden noise made us spin around, a scraping sound, like claws on stone. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was massive, standing on all fours yet towering over us. Its body was covered in matted fur, muscles rippling beneath the surface. The face resembled a wolverine's, but grotesquely enlarged, with a maw full of jagged teeth that glinted in the flashlight beam. "Open fire," I shouted. We unleashed a barrage of bullets, the cave lighting up with muzzle flashes. The creature roared, a sound that rattled my bones, but it didn't falter. It lunged at Garcia, swatting him aside like a rag doll. He hit the wall with a sickening thud and crumpled to the ground. "Fall back," I ordered. We scrambled towards the exit, Miller dragging Garcia's limp form. The creature blocked our path, its eyes reflecting a feral intelligence. It swiped at Miller, claws tearing through his vest. He screamed, blood spurting from deep gashes. "Cover me," I yelled to Jones. I tossed a flashbang grenade towards the beast. The explosion of light and sound disoriented it for a precious few seconds. We seized the moment, rushing past and out into the forest. Behind us, the creature's enraged roar echoed, spurring us to run faster. Garcia was unconscious, his pulse weak. Miller was bleeding profusely, his face contorted in pain. "We need to stop the bleeding," Jones said, his hands shaking as he fumbled for a medical kit. I tore open Miller's pack, pulling out bandages. "Hold still," I told him, pressing gauze against his wounds. "That thing, what was that?" Miller gasped between ragged breaths. "Not the time," I replied, though I had no answers. A chilling howl pierced the air, a sound that seemed to come from all directions. "It's hunting us," Jones said, eyes wide. "Then let's not be easy prey," I snapped back. We fashioned a makeshift stretcher for Garcia and pressed on, every rustle in the underbrush setting our nerves on edge. The fog had thickened, and the GPS was malfunctioning, the screen flickering erratically. "Technology's great until it isn't," Jones muttered. "Can you navigate by the stars?" I asked Miller. He gave a weak grin. Astronomy wasn't exactly my best subject. "Great," I said. "Remind me to file a complaint with HQ about our lack of Boy Scout training." We stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin, its wooden structure warped by time and neglect. It wasn't much, but it offered shelter. "Barricade the doors and windows," I instructed. Inside, the cabin was sparse. An old table, a rusted stove, and a fireplace filled with ash. Miller collapsed onto the floor, his breathing shallow. Garcia hadn't stirred, his condition worsening. "He's burning up," Jones said, checking Garcia's forehead. "We need to get them out of here." "And go where?" I replied. "We're sitting ducks out there." A heavy thud hit the side of the cabin, causing the walls to shudder. "Looks like staying isn't much better," Jones quipped. "Got any more of those flashbangs?" Miller asked weakly. "Fresh out," I said, "but I have an idea." I rummaged through the cabin, finding a canister of kerosene and some old rags. "We're going to give our friend a warm welcome." We prepared Molotov cocktails, the improvised weapons our last line of defense. The creature began clawing at the door, wood splintering under its assault. "On my mark," I said, positioning ourselves near the windows. The door burst open, and the beast barreled inside. Up close, it was even more terrifying, a nightmare given flesh. I hurled the flaming bottle at it. The glass shattered on impact, flames engulfing the creature. It let out a screech that rattled the windows. "Burn, you overgrown furball," Jones shouted. But the victory was short-lived. The creature, ablaze yet undeterred, lunged towards us. We dove out of its path as it crashed through the wall, disappearing back into the forest. The fire illuminated its path like a twisted comet. "We need to move now," I ordered. Gathering what little we had, we ventured back into the night. The forest was alive with sounds, the crackling of flames, the creature's distant wails, our own ragged breath. The situation was dire, but giving up wasn't in my nature. As my old man used to say, when life gives you lemons, make sure they're not grenades. Hours seemed like days as we navigated the treacherous terrain. At first light, we reached a clearing that offered a glimmer of Hopia, makeshift helipad used by logging companies. A rusty radio tower stood nearby. "Think that radio works?" Jones asked, skepticism dripping from his word. "Only one way to find out," I replied. I scaled the tower, the metal groaning under my weight. Reaching the top, I fiddled with the controls, praying for a miracle. "This is Alpha Team, requesting immediate extraction," I spoke into the mic. "Priority 1, do you copy?" "Stat. Come on, don't fail me, Net." A crackle, then a voice. "Copy, Alpha Team. This is base. What's your situation?" "Multiple casualties, hostile engagement. Coordinates transmitting." "Roger that. Extraction ETA 30 minutes. Hold tight." Relief washed over me. but it was fleeting. From my vantage point, I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. The creature, its fur singed, patches of skin raw, was stalking towards the other. "Guys, we've got company," I shouted. I slid down the ladder, nearly losing my footing. Hitting the ground, I raced towards Jones and Miller. "Set up a defensive perimeter," I barked. "With what?" Jones shot back. Harsh language. "Got any better ideas?" He sighed. I knew I should have become a dentist like my mother wanted. The creature charged, its eyes fixed on us with murderous intent. We fired our remaining rounds, but it shrugged off the bullets as if they were mere mosquito bites. Suddenly, a deafening roar filled the air, not from the creature, but from above. The cavalry had arrived. A helicopter swooped in low, its side door open, a gunner at the ready. "Get down," I yelled. The gunner unleashed a torrent of heavy caliber rounds, striking the beast. This time, it felt the impact. The creature stumbled, blood spurting from multiple wounds. With a final, splitting howl, it collapsed. "Talk about bringing a knife to a gunfight," Jones remarked. Medics rushed out as the chopper landed, tending to Miller and Garcia. I took a moment to catch my breath, surveying the fallen creature. Up close, it was a grotesque amalgamation of feature-spart Wolverine, part something else entirely. "Looks like Mother Nature's bad joke," I muttered. A figure approached Colonel Harding, a stern man with a face carved from granite. "Captain Thompson," he greeted me curtly. "Care to explain?" "Wish I could, sir," I replied. We encountered that. He eyed the creature impassively. "Classified," he said. "You and your men will debrief at base." "With all due respect, sir, what is that thing?" "Above your pay grade, Captain." I bit back a retort. Typical. We risk our necks, and the brass keeps us in the dark. As we lifted off, I glanced back at the clearing. Already, a team in hazmat suits was swarming the site, collecting samples, disposing of evidence. Miller was stabilized, color returning to his cheeks. Garcia was still unconscious but alive. Jones leaned over. "You think they'll give us a bonus for this?" I chuckled. "Sure, maybe a nice fruit basket." He grinned. "As long as it's not apples. I'm allergic." Despite everything, we managed to laugh. Dark humor was our way of coping, a shield against the insanity we faced. Back at the base, we were herded into separate rooms, grilled for hours by men in suits who probably hadn't seen daylight in years. My answers were met with stoic faces and curt nods. "You're to speak of this to no one of them instructed. "National security. Figures," I replied. Just another day at the office. They didn't appreciate the sarcasm. Weeks passed, and we were given downtime, a mandatory rest period. I spent it trying to make sense of what happened. One evening, Miller, Jones, and I met at a bar off base. Garcia was still recovering, but expected to pull through. "To surviving the world's worst camping trip," Miller toasted, raising his glass. "I'll drink to that," Jones agreed as we clinked glasses. A news report caught my eye on the bar's TV, a story about missing hikers in the Kyrgyz mountains. The anchor mentioned wild animal attacks, urging caution. "Wild animals, huh?" Miller mused. "That's one way to... At least, they didn't blame it on a bear," I said. "I'd hate to see the size of the trap needed for that beat." We shared a knowing look. The official story would never reflect the reality we faced, but perhaps that was for the best. Some truths are too heavy for the world to bear. As the night wore on, the weight of the experience began to lift, if only slightly. We swapped stories, laughed at old jokes, and found solace in camaraderie. You think we'll ever get hazard pay for fighting mutant creatures? Jones asked, half-joke. Only if we start a union, I replied. Green Berets Local 151. Miller chuckled. Our slogan can be, we do the impossible, but don't ask us how. We laughed, the sound cutting through the haze of smoke and the clatter of glasses. For a moment, things felt normal, but deep down, I knew that the world was stranger than any of us realized, and somewhere, in some forgotten corner of the earth, other shadows lurked, waiting for the unaware. Another round? The bartender asked. I glanced at my empty glass. Why not? Here's to making it out in one piece. Mostly, Miller added, tapping the bandage on his arm. Details. I waved him off. The bartender set down fresh drinks. You boys have any good stories from over? I met his gaze and smiled. Really, nothing you'd believe. He chuckled, trying. I considered it for a moment, then shook my head. Maybe next time. As we raised our glasses once more, I couldn't help but think that some tales are best left untold. The thing about northern Wisconsin is that nobody ever expects anything strange to happen there. But I'm here to tell you different. My name is Jake, and back in '87, I was living in a cabin outside of Eagle River. It was a simple life, chopping wood, fishing, hunting. I wasn't running from anything, just trying to live off the grid. Figured staying away from people meant staying away from their problems, you know. Turns out, I was dead wrong. That year I was trapping along the Wisconsin River, hoping to snag a decent haul of beaver pelts before the snow hit. Trapping wasn't my main gig, but the pelts sold well, and it gave me something to do. I was out early one morning, checking my traps and getting ready to pack up when I noticed something off about the woods. It was quiet. I mean, dead quiet. Not even the wind in the trees or the usual rustling of critters. At first, I thought maybe a wolf or a bear had come through, but the air felt wrong. It's hard to describe, but anyone who spent time alone in the wilderness knows that feeling, like the world is holding its breath. I didn't have a gun on me that day, just a hatchet and a skinning knife. Wasn't expecting trouble. I'd always been careful with guns after a few close calls when I was younger. Figured my hatchet was good enough if anything got too close. Then, just as I was about to pack up the last trap, I saw something by the water. At first, it looked like a deer, but it was hunched over, and its legs were too long. The thing was standing on two legs, but bent over like it was sick or injured. Its fur was matted and dark, not the usual reddish-brown of the deer up there. And it was big taller than me, and I'm no small guy at 6 feet. I figured it had to be some kind of diseased animal, maybe even rabid. I made the mistake of stepping closer. The thing turned its head towards me, and that's when I saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. It had this snout, kind of like a wolf's, but with no real features. just skin stretched tight over bone. No nose, no mouth, nothing. It locked onto me with those empty eyes, and that's when I knew I was in serious trouble. I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes on it, my hand gripping the handle of the hatchet so tight my knuckles turned white. The thing didn't move at first, just stared me down. Then, without warning, it jerked upright and started moving toward me, fast. I bolted. I've never been much for running, but when something like that is chasing you, you find new motivation. The trees blurred as I sprinted through the woods, my boots pounding against the earth, my breath ragged. Behind me, I could hear it crashing through the brush. It wasn't a sound like a normal animal, more like bones rattling, like the earth itself was being torn up. I don't know how far I ran. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes before I stumbled across an old hunting shed. I wasn't thinking straight, just barreled through the door and slammed it shut, breathing hard, listening to the pounding of my heart. For a while, there was silence. I sat there hunched over, hatchet still in hand, my breath slowly calming. Then the door rattled, just a slight sound, barely enough to hear over my breathing. I froze, my grip tightening on the hatchet's hand. The rattling stopped. A second later, the thing began to scratch at the door, slow and deliberate, like it was testing the wood. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. No windows, no way out except for the door, and that thing wasn't going to leave until it got in. The scratching got louder, more frantic, and then I heard something that chilled me to the core, a voice that sounded human, but not quite right. It was like someone trying to speak with their mouth sewn shut. I couldn't make out the words, but it was coming from just outside the door. Then it stopped. Silence again. I stood up, cautiously moving towards the door. I don't know what I thought I was going to do. Maybe try to catch it off guard, swing the hatchet if it broke through. But just as I got close, the door splintered and the thing's hand, if you could call it a hand, shot through the gap. It grabbed my arm before I could react, the skin cold and rough, like dried leather. I swung the hatchet, but the thing yanked me through the door before I could make contact, tossing me into the dirt outside like I weighed nothing. I landed hard, the wind knocked out of me. When I looked up, the thing was standing over me, that featureless face staring down. I swung the hatchet again, catching it in the side of its leg. It didn't even flinch. Instead, it crouched down, its snout inches from my face. That's when I noticed the smell, rotting meat, like a carcass left out in the sun too long. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I spat in its face. Not the smartest move, but hey, it made me feel a little better. The thing jerked back, and in that split second, I scrambled to my feet and ran again, this time towards the river. I figured if I could make it to the water, maybe I could lose it. I reached the riverbank, my legs burning, lungs on fire, and dove into the freezing water. The shock of the cold nearly knocked me out, but it also jolted me back to reality. I swam as fast as I could, keeping my head low, hoping the thing wouldn't follow. When I finally made it to the other side, I dragged myself up onto the rocks, shivering and soaked, but alive. I looked back, expecting to see it still standing there, but the thing was gone, vanished. The walk back to my cabin was the longest of my life. Every sound, every rustle in the trees had me on edge. But by the time I got home, nothing had followed me. At least, not that I could see. The next day, I went back to the trap site. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to know if it was still there. The traps were all sprung, and something had torn them apart like they were made of paper. There were no tracks, no sign of anything unusual, except for one thing: claw marks. Deep and deliberate, etched into a nearby tree. I never trapped again after that. Sold the cabin the next year and moved south. People laugh when I tell them why. I don't blame them. Hell, I'd laugh too if I hadn't seen it myself. They say the woods up there are quiet, maybe a little too quiet. If you ever find yourself in northern Wisconsin and you notice the woods go silent, you might want to reconsider how deep you go. Something out there doesn't like being disturbed. And trust me, it's not something you want to meet. As for me, well, I've developed a healthy fear of anything that walks on two legs but isn't supposed to. Can't say I miss those woods. Not one bit. Jack, a trucker for the better part of his life, had seen his fair share of the strange and unsettling on the road. But nothing could prepare him for the night he found himself on a desolate stretch of Highway 13, deep in the heart of nowhere. It was one of those nights where the air hung heavy, thick with an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Cell service was non-existent, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the unsettling feeling that something was amiss. He was hauling a load of construction materials, a run-of-the-mill job with a flexible deadline. The road was deserted, not a single soul in sight. Just the lonely hum of his engine and the piercing beam of his headlights cutting through the inky blackness. Jack knew these roads like the back of his hand, every twist and turn, every bump and dip. So, when the road seemed to shift beneath him, as if it wasn't quite right, a cold dread washed over him. Slowing down, he squinted into the darkness, trying to make sense of the unsettling feeling. His headlights glinted off something up ahead, a mangled mess of metal strewn across the road. At first he thought it was a wreck, but as he got closer, he realized there was no vehicle, just a jumble of debris scattered haphazardly. Jack pulled over, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped out into the humid night. The sound of cicadas was deafening, a constant buzz that filled the otherwise eerie silence. The scene was bizarre. Metal beams, pipes, and what looked like parts of an old rusted trailer lay twisted and broken. There was no sign of any other vehicle, no skid marks, nothing to explain how this wreckage ended up here. As he cautiously navigated the debris, his flashlight beam landed on something shiny, a cracked side mirror hanging from a chunk of metal. It was from a truck, that much he knew. But there was no truck in sight. The whole situation felt wrong, and Jack's gut screamed at him to get back in his rig and drive away. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard it, a faint, muffled cry coming from somewhere within the wreckage. His heart pounding, Jack pushed aside some of the metal, and there, trapped beneath a twisted beam, was a man. His face was bloodied, his clothes torn, but he was alive. "Help me," the man whispered, his voice barely audible. "I've got you," Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just hang on, okay? I'll get you out of here." As he lifted the last piece of metal off the man, Jack noticed something strange. The man was wearing a uniform, dirty and tattered, but unmistakably a uniform. It was then that it hit him. This man was a trucker, just like him, but the uniform was unlike any he'd ever seen, old and outdated, like something from decades ago. "Who did this to you?" Jack asked, but the man didn't respond. He just stared at Jack with hollow eyes, his breathing shallow and labored. Jack fumbled for his phone, but of course there was no signal. He had to get this man to a hospital, but the nearest one was miles away. Jack decided to drive back to the last town he passed. It wasn't far, and they had a small clinic. It was the man's only shot. "Hang in there," Jack said, lifting him as gently as he could. But as he moved him, he noticed something else. The man's hands were rough and calloused, but his fingernails were torn and bloody, as if he'd been clawing at something, desperately trying to escape. Jack's gut twisted with unease, but he had no time to dwell on it. He got the man into the cab, laying him across the passenger seat, and floored it. As they drove, the man's breathing grew weaker, his skin pale and clamped. Jack kept glancing over at him, half expecting him to explain what had happened. But the man just stared out the windshield, his eyes unfocused. Suddenly, the man grabbed Jack's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "He's coming," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You have to get away. He's coming for you too." Jack's blood ran cold. Who's coming?" But before the man could answer, his body went limp, his grip loosening as his eyes rolled back in his head. Jack cursed under his breath, pushing the truck even harder. The town was just a few miles away, and he could already see the faint glow of streetlights on the horizon. Screeching to a halt in front of the clinic, Jack jumped out and ran inside, shouting for help. A nurse and a doctor rushed out, and together they got the man inside. They took over, trying to stabilize him as Jack stood there helpless. After what felt like an eternity, the doctor came out shaking his head. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice somber. "He didn't make it. He was too far gone." Jack nodded numbly, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on him. "Do you know who he was?" The doctor looked at him strangely. He didn't have any ID on him, and from the look of his injuries, he's been through hell. But there's something you need to see. He led Jack back into the room where the man's body lay covered with a sheet. The doctor pulled it back, revealing the man's chest. Jack's heart skipped a beat when he saw it. Deep, jagged scars crisscrossed his torso, as if he'd been cut open and stitched back together countless times. And on his arm, a faded, barely legible number was tattooed. "What the hell?" Jack muttered, feeling a wave of nausea. "I've seen something like this before," the doctor said, his voice grim. "Years ago, there was a truck driver found in a similar condition not too far from here. Same scars, same tattoo. The guy was never identified, and the case was never solved." Jack's mind reeled. How could this be possible? Was this the same man? Or was there something else going on here, something much darker than he could have ever imagined? Whatever happened to him, the doctor continued, it wasn't an accident. Someone did this to him, and if what he told you is true, you need to be careful. Jack left the clinic in a daze, his thoughts a whirlwind. As he got back in his truck, he glanced at the passenger seat, half expecting to see the man sitting there, warning him again. But the seat was empty, just a faint blood stain where he had been. He started the engine and drove out of town, his eyes scanning the road ahead, every shadow seeming to hold a hidden threat. He didn't know who or what had done this, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stick around to find out. Whatever had happened to that man, he wasn't going to let it happen to him. Jack drove through the night, not stopping until he reached the safety of a well-lit truck stop miles away. As he sat there, the engine idling, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was out there lurking in the darkness, waiting for its next victim. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let it catch. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, he pulled out of the truck stop and drove on, leaving the horrors of that night behind. The road stretched out ahead, endless and empty, and Jack kept driving, not daring to look back. Back in '88, I made the mistake of thinking I could handle the wilderness alone. My name's Jake, and I'd been living off the grid for about 7 years when this all went down. I had a cabin I built myself, tucked away in the Flathead National Forest in Montana. It was small, but it had everything I needed: a wood-burning stove, a nearby water source, and a mile-long trail that led to the closest town, a speck of a place called Owando. Population? Maybe 75, if you counted the dogs. I wasn't some doomsday prepper or anything. I just liked my space, liked working with my hands. I fished, hunted, chopped my own wood, and didn't have to deal with anyone's crap. Life was simple, good, but that year something changed. There was talk about missing campers, hikers who vanished. You'd hear it from the occasional visitor passing through Owando, or if you were eavesdropping at the saloon. I didn't think much of it at first. People got lost in the woods all the time. It's what happens when city folk underestimate nature. But then 2 rangers were found dead, gutted like deer. That's when things started feeling wrong. I'd always been a solitary guy, but when you spend that much time alone, you learn to pay attention. You notice patterns, rhythms. You get a sense when the forest is off. I remember it was a Wednesday. Don't ask me how, but it was. I was out chopping wood, and everything just went silent. The birds, the chipmunks, even the damn wind. Dead quiet, like someone hit the mute button on the whole forest. I wasn't one to scare easy, but I'm not an idiot either. I put down the axe and went inside, grabbing my shotgun. Yeah, I had guns, lots of them, but I didn't carry one around like some paranoid freak. The only time I'd had to use it was on a black bear that got a little too interested in my smokehouse. That day, though, I felt like something was watching me. You ever get that feeling? Like someone standing right behind you, breathing down your neck? I chalked it up to nerves at first, but it kept gnawing at me. So, I took a walk around the perimeter, checked my traps, made sure everything was as it should be. And that's when I saw the first tracks. Now, I've hunted just about everything that crawls, swims, or flies, but these tracks, these were new. Huge. I mean, huge. Bigger than any bear, with these long claw marks, like something had been dragging them deep into the dirt. But the shape of the print itself was wrong. Bears leave a pretty distinct mark, even the big ones. This was different, longer, thinner, almost feline, except it wasn't a cat, not by a long shot. I crouched down, running my fingers over the indentations. Whatever made these was heavy, probably 300, 400 pounds. I stood up, staring at the tree line. If whatever it was wanted me, I figured it would have made a move by then. But there was nothing, just that eerie silence hanging over the woods like a shroud. Later that night, after a few stiff drinks, I tried to let it go. Maybe a rogue mountain lion, a big one. I'd dealt with cougars before, and while they could be dangerous, they weren't exactly tearing apart experienced rangers. I secured the cabin, bolted the door, and lay down on my cot. Sleep didn't come easy, though. My mind was stuck on those prints. Around midnight, I woke up to a thud. Not a knock, not a crash, just a deep, heavy thud, like something massive had hit the side of the cabin. I bolted upright, reaching for the shotgun by the bed. I stayed quiet, listening. Another thud, and then the unmistakable sound of wood splintering. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural noise. Something was outside, scratching at the walls, almost methodically. I felt a chill, an instinctive kind of terror that you can't explain. I crept to the window and peered through a crack in the curtain. Nothing. I kept the shotgun close, inching toward the door. The scratching stopped, but I could hear something shifting, moving around the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. The damn thing was circling me. I knew I wasn't getting out that front door. Whatever it was out there waiting for me to make a stupid move. I needed to buy myself some time, so I made for the cellar trap door in the floor, pulled it open, climbed down, and locked it behind me. The cellar wasn't anything fancy, just dirt walls and some shelves with canned goods. I crouched down, holding the shotgun ready. I figured I'd wait it out, but then I heard footsteps above me, slow, deliberate. It knew I was down there. I wasn't going to sit and wait for whatever was stalking me to make the first move. There's one thing about living off the grid. You don't depend on anyone, but you don't wait around to be saved either. I pushed the shelf aside, revealing a small tunnel I dug as an emergency escape route. It led about 50 yards out into the forest. Yeah, I was paranoid enough to dig an escape tunnel, but right then I was damn glad I had. I crawled through the tunnel, moving as quietly as I could. I reached the exit and slowly lifted the wooden hatch. The night air hit my face, cold and crisp. I didn't see anything, but I could still hear it sniffing, searching. I had to get out of there. I stayed low, moving through the trees, heading toward the river. There was a ranger station about 5 miles south. Maybe they could help me figure out what the hell was happening. I hadn't made it more than 100 yards when I heard a scream. A human scream. High-pitched, terrified. It was close, too close. My instincts told me to run, but I couldn't just leave whoever it was out there. I made my way toward the sound, carefully, cautiously. That's when I saw it. A figure hunched over, dragging something. Someone. The body was limp, and I could see the blood trailing behind. The thing, whatever it was, had its back to me. It was huge, bigger than any animal I'd ever seen, covered in thick, matted fur. Its arms were long, unnaturally so, with claws that scraped the ground as it moved. But the face was wrong. It wasn't a bear, not even close. It had the snout of a wolf, but stretched out, almost exaggerated, like a grotesque caricature. And its teeth, rows of sharp, jagged teeth that looked like they were designed for one thing, killing. I raised the shotgun, but before I could pull the trigger, it turned. It stared at me, sniffing the air, its mouth curling into what I can only describe as a twisted grin. It dropped the body and charged. I fired, hit it square in the chest, but it barely flinched. I fired again and again. The thing howled no, it screamed, like it was more frustrated than hurt. It lunged at me, and I dove to the side, scrambling for cover behind a tree. I was breathing hard, trying to keep my hands from shaking. I heard it thrashing through the underbrush, circling again, just like it had before, but this time it wasn't alone. I could hear more of them, surrounding me, closing in. I was screwed. I ran. I didn't care where. I just ran. Branches whipped against my face, the cold air burning in my lungs. I could hear them behind me, closing in. I wasn't going to make it to the ranger station. I knew that. But I wasn't going to die there either. Not like that. I spotted a ridge up ahead, a steep drop down to the river below. I didn't have time to think. I leaped, the ground disappearing beneath me as I tumbled down the slope, crashing through the underbrush. The cold water hit me like a sledgehammer, but I didn't stop. I let the current carry me. It would take me far enough away from whatever the hell those things were. When I finally dragged myself onto the riverbank, coughing and freezing, I looked back. Nothing. They hadn't followed me. Or maybe they couldn't. I made it to the ranger station by morning, banged on the door until my knuckles bled. When they let me in, I told them everything. The tracks, the creature, the bodies. They looked at me like I was crazy. But when they went back to my cabin, the blood trail was still there. They found the body too, what was left of it. They called it a freak animal attack, said it must have been a wolf or a bear, but I knew better. I'd seen it, and whatever it was still out there, or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it had followed me after all. It all started with a wrong turn. Back in '93, I was heading up to Eureka to see an old buddy. Figured I'd ditch the highway and take the scenic route. Always liked those empty back roads, just me and my thoughts, you know. Name's Raylan, by the way. Didn't know that wrong turn was gonna land me in a whole heap of trouble. See, I've always been a bit of a loner. Grew up bouncing between foster homes, never really put down roots. Just me and my beat-up truck, roaming around, picking up odd jobs here and there. Mechanic, plumber, whatever needed fixing, I could handle it, except for what I ran into that day. This was before everyone had GPS, and I was never one for maps. Always trusted my gut, and it usually got me where I needed to go, but not this time. The road got narrower and narrower, hemmed in by these massive redwoods. Sunlight vanished, shadows got long, and I started to get this creepy feeling like I was being watched. Should have turned back, but stubborn me, I kept going. Hours passed, and I was seriously lost. No towns, no signs of life, just endless trees. Gas was running low, and I was starting to sweat. Then, through the trees, I spotted it. An old rundown house. Looked like it had been abandoned for years, but something about it felt off. Still, I didn't have much choice. Pulled up to the house, and the whole place just screamed trouble. Rusted out cars, animal bones scattered everywhere, and what looked like bloodstains on the porch. Knocked on the door, and this giant of a man opened up. Dude looked like he hadn't seen a decent meal in years, eyes all hollowed out. Didn't say a word, just stared at me like I was an unwelcome guest. "Hey there," I said, trying to keep my cool. Got myself a bit turned around. "Any idea where the nearest gas station might be?" He just kept staring, then tilted his head, and I saw two more guys behind him. Smaller, hunched over, same blank look in their eyes. One was clutching this nasty-looking rusty knife. The whole scene was giving me the creeps. Okay then," I mumbled, backing away. "Guess I'll just..." That's when the big guy stepped forward, blocking my way. "Shouldn't have come here," he growled. His voice was deep and menacing. My heart started hammering in my chest. I glanced back at my truck, figuring my chances of making a run for it. But before I could move, I heard footsteps behind me. Turned around, and there was this woman, just as grimy as the men, but with this unsettling smile on her face. And in her hands, a shotgun pointed right at me. "Stay put," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "We don't get many visitors." Trapped. 3 guys, a woman with a shotgun, and me with nothing but a pocket knife. They herded me inside, and the stench hit me like a wall. Rotting meat, blood, that thick, cloying smell of decay. The place was filthy, the floor stained, the walls covered in grime. They didn't talk much, just grunted and pointed for me to sit down. Shotgun lady kept that barrel trained on me the whole time. In the middle of the room was this massive table piled high with raw meat, flies buzzing all over it. I almost lost my lunch right there. One of the guys sat across from me, this creepy grin plastered on his face. "Hungry?" he asked. "No, thanks," I managed to choke out, just trying to find my way back to the road. The woman let out this chilling laugh. "Road? There ain't no road here anymore." Didn't like the sound of that. The big guy was by the door, no way out. They started tearing into that raw meat with their bare hands, like a pack of wild animals. I used the distraction to look for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing. The woman kept watching me, even while she ate. "You've come a long way," she said. her voice sending shivers down my spine. Not many folks find this place. I didn't say a word, didn't want to give away how scared I was. Then she stood up and nodded to one of the guys. Show him the others. That's when I knew I was in deep trouble. He led me down this dark hallway, the smell of death getting stronger with every step. He opened a door, and I saw a room full of shelves. And on those shelves, skulls, bones, clothes, human remains. Some of the skulls still had hair clinging to them. I almost threw up. They came here too, the guy said, with this sick sense of pride. But none of them left. I had to get out of there. They were distracted, so I made a break for it, ran down the hall, slammed into the big guy, and sprinted for my truck. Got the engine roaring and tore out of there, tires spitting gravel. But they were right behind me. In my mirror, I saw their rusty pickup gaining fast. The woman was hanging out the window, shotgun blazing. A shot blew out my side mirror, and I swerved to avoid a tree. They were closing in. Had to think fast. Saw a sharp turn ahead, leading down into a ravine. It was a crazy idea, but it was my only shot. I yanked the wheel, and the truck went careening down the slope, smashing into rocks and trees. Everything went black. When I woke up, the truck was on its side, windshield shattered, blood running down my face. But I was alive. Heard them up above, yelling and crashing through the brush. They were coming. I scrambled out of the truck and dragged myself into the undergrowth. No plan, just pure survival instinct. My leg was screaming in pain, but I couldn't stop. They were getting closer. Then I saw it, a clearing, and beyond that, a cliff overlooking a river. If I could make it there, maybe I could jump, get away. I pushed myself harder than I ever had. The pain, a distant echo. Reached the edge, lungs burning, and turned to face them. The woman was there, shotgun aimed at my heart. Should have stayed in the truck, she smirked. I looked over the edge. Long way down, but it was my only chance. I jumped. Hit the water hard, but the fall wasn't as bad as I thought. The cold was a shock, but I swam like hell, the current pulling me downstream. Heard a gunshot, the bullet splashing close by, but they couldn't follow. Don't know how long I was in that water, but eventually I made it to the bank, collapsed in the mud, half drowned but alive. Thought I was safe. Then I heard footsteps, looked up, and there he was, the big guy, standing at the edge of the trees, just watching me. Didn't say a word, just gave me that same blank smile. Then he turned and walked back into the woods. Never saw them again, but I know they're out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting for the next lost soul to stumble across their path. Back in one, I was stationed at the White River National Forest in Colorado. Been working there for years. My name's Jake Reynolds. But my buddies called me Mountain Goat because I could scramble over any terrain without breaking a sweat. Not the coolest nickname, but when you're surrounded by bears, wolves, and mountain lions, being compared to something sure-footed isn't so bad. I always loved my job. at least until that summer. It started like any other, with campers, hikers, and the usual bunch of college kids who thought they could conquer the wilderness with a six-pack and a map. I was already wiped from hauling a group of clueless teenagers out of the woods the week before when the emergency call came in on a Thursday afternoon. 2 hikers, Mark and Chris, were reported missing. They hadn't made it back to their car after 3 days. No contact, nothing. It wasn't unusual. People wander off trail all the time and usually turn up sunburnt and sheepish. Dispatch figured this was the same deal, but something caught my eye. The report mentioned weird animal sounds in the area. That's why they called in someone with experience, me. They saddled me with a rookie ranger named Ben, barely 2 months on the job. Ben had that cocky swagger of someone who thought a bear was the worst thing he'd encounter in the woods. Good kid, but green. The trail we took to find Mark and Chris wasn't a tough one, well marked and popular with hikers. It snaked deep into the forest, down towards a riverbed, then looped back to higher ground. I figured we'd find them camped off trail, maybe a twisted ankle or something. Ben and I hiked for hours, the radio crackling with static, typical for that area. The pines closed in around us, thick and heavy. Around dusk, we stumbled on our first sign of trouble. A trashed campsite, tents shredded, a cooking pot with burnt beans spilled next to a cold fire. No sign of the guys themselves. Ben raised an eyebrow. Bear. I shook my head. Bears don't tear up a camp like this without leaving tracks or scavenging for food. No claw marks, no fur. I crouched by a ripped sleeping bag. This wasn't claws. Something with raw strength did this. I could feel Ben tense up. What do you think did this, Jake? I didn't answer. The silence was enough to spook him. We pushed on, the shadows getting longer, twisting the trees into weird shapes. Then I heard it. A faint rustling in the leaves, like something moving just out of sight. Ben didn't notice at first, but I did. It was a sound that didn't belong in the stillness of the forest. I held up my hand, signaling him to stop. We waited. The sound came again, closer this time. I didn't like it one bit. I pulled out my knife, not that it would do much good, but it was better than nothing. Ben gave me a look, half worried, half confused, but he kept his mouth shut. Smart kid. The noise stopped, leaving us in that creepy quiet again. We followed the riverbank until we reached a muddy patch, perfect for footprints. There were a few human prints heading towards the water, but something else too, something big. The prints were wide, way bigger than a human's, but I couldn't make out the shape in the fading light. It wasn't anything I recognized. Ben knelt down, tracing the outline with his fingers. What the hell is that, Jake? I didn't answer. Truth was, I had no clue. We kept moving, but each step felt heavier now. The air grew thick, like the whole forest was watching us. I'm not a superstitious guy, but something felt off about this place, like we weren't meant to be there. I didn't say anything to Ben, but I could tell he felt it too, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder. It wasn't long before we found them, Mark and Chris, or what was left of them. They were sprawled near a clearing, torn apart. I mean literally torn apart. Limbs scattered, faces unrecognizable. I'd seen animal attacks before, bears and mountain lions, but this was different. This was savage, but not in the way an animal kills to eat. This was personal. Ben went pale, and I thought he might puke. He mumbled something about getting out of there, but I ignored him. My eyes were glued to the tracks leading away from the body. Whatever did this had walked away on two legs. I tried the radio, but nothing, just static. Figures. I told Ben we had to go, and that's when we heard something moving through the trees, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. It was the same sound I'd heard earlier, but louder now, heavier, like whatever it was didn't care if we knew it was there. Ben started backing up, and for the first time I saw real fear in his eyes. Not the kind you get when a bear shows up, but the kind that chills you to the bone because you know you're dealing with something you don't understand. We didn't wait to see what it was. We ran. I'd run from bears before, scrambled up rocks to avoid mountain lions, but this was different. It felt like the forest itself was pushing us back, urging us to get the hell out. Every tree seemed to lean in, narrowing the path, making it harder to escape. Ben tripped, nearly falling flat on his face. I hauled him back up, but I could hear it now, whatever it was. Breathing heavy, slow, like each breath was calculated. It wasn't chasing us, not exactly, but it wasn't far behind either. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. I don't even know how to describe the thing. Tall, easily over 7 feet, maybe more. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over muscle and bone in a way that just looked wrong. I couldn't see a face, just a vague shape, but the way it moved, slow and deliberate, wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. It had the stance of a man, but the movements of something predatory, like it was stalking us. Ben saw it too, and that was all it took. He yelled something about getting out, about dying here, but I barely heard him. Adrenaline kicked in, my focus narrowed. I didn't look back again. All I could do was run, one foot in front of the other, hoping to God whatever was behind us wouldn't catch up. The path split, and without thinking, I grabbed Ben's arm and dragged him down the left fork. It led towards the cliffs near the... I could hear the thing behind us, crashing through the underbrush like it didn't care what was in its way. It was getting closer, I could feel it. Then I saw the cliff edge ahead, and I knew we were out of options. Ben was panting, stumbling beside me, his eyes wild with fear. I didn't stop. I didn't give him a chance to think. I shoved him towards the cliff. We slid down the rocky slope, dirt and gravel tearing at my skin. I heard Ben hit the bottom with a grunt, but I didn't stop to check if he was okay. I scrambled to my feet, pulling him up as the thing came to a halt at the top of the cliff, staring down at him. It didn't move for a moment. I thought maybe we were safe, that it wouldn't follow us down the steep incline. But then, with those slow, deliberate movements, it started climbing down. Its long arms reached for the rocks like it had done this 100 times before. Ben was shaking, his breath coming in short gasps. He wanted to run, I could see it in his eyes, but I grabbed his arm, forcing him to stay still. If we ran now, we wouldn't make it. The thing reached the bottom of the cliff, its eyes, or whatever passed for eyes, locking onto us. It didn't roar or growl, didn't make a sound at all. It just moved towards us, slow, methodical, like it knew we had nowhere left to go. I don't know what came over me. Maybe adrenaline, maybe desperation, but I pulled the flare gun from my pack. I only had one shot, but it was better than nothing. Ben was too scared to do anything but stare as I raised the flare gun, aiming at the thing's chest. I pulled the trigger. The flare shot out, bright and burning, hitting the creature square in the chest. For a second, it staggered back, its body jerking as if in surprise. Then it let out a sound, a deep, guttural noise that vibrated through my bones. It wasn't a sound of pain, but of anger. The thing didn't die. It didn't even fall. But it stopped. It looked at me, then at Ben, and then, without warning, it turned and walked back into the trees. I don't know why it left us. Maybe the flare heard it. Maybe it didn't see us as worth the effort anymore. But whatever the reason, it was gone, disappearing into the forest as silently as it had appeared. We didn't stick around to find out why. When we finally made it back to the trailhead, I called it in. Mark and Chris were dead, that much was clear. As for what killed them, I didn't have an explanation. I filed the report, described the bodies, but I didn't mention the thing we saw. People believe what they want to believe. As for me, I'm still here, still working the same trails. But I stay away from the river now. Some places you just don't go, and whatever that thing was, it's still out there. The day started like any other, quiet and uneventful. But by the time the sun dipped low, nothing would be the same. It was 2001, and I was living on the outskirts of Ashland, Oregon. My name's Jake Collins, and if you'd asked me back then why I chose to live in such a remote area, I'd probably say something like, I prefer the company of trees to people, which wasn't exactly a lie. Ashland was one of those picturesque towns people visited for the Shakespeare Festival and art galleries. But a few miles out, you had nothing but dense woods, the kind where cell service gave up a long time ago, and the only thing you could count on hearing was the occasional rustling of deer, or, if you were unlucky, something bigger. I liked it that way, until I didn't. My cabin was isolated, a solid 15-minute drive from the nearest neighbor, which was more of a feature than a bug in my eyes. I'd been living there for a few years, doing odd jobs, fixing up old trucks, the kind of quiet life that left plenty of time for thinking but little for complications. That's why what happened next hit me like a punch to the gut, something that broke the peace I had so carefully built. That evening, I was working on an old Chevy in the garage, the kind of rust bucket that people like me could spend weeks tinkering with. The air was cool, and the wind was whispering through the trees. If I'd paid more attention, I might have noticed the quiet too quiet, even for the woods, but I was too wrapped up in getting that damn carburetor to fit just right. It started with a sound. At first I thought it was just a bear rummaging through the underbrush. They weren't uncommon, especially around fall, but this was different. It was more deliberate, almost like something was watching, waiting. My back stiffened, and I set the wrench down, listening. There it was again, a rustle. Too heavy to be the wind and too steady to be an animal just passing by. I shrugged it off, figuring it was probably a deer. Still, something in the back of my mind didn't feel right. It's hard to explain, but it was like an instinct, that primal part of your brain that screams when danger is close. But hey, I'd lived out here for years, and the worst thing that had ever happened was a raccoon getting into my trash. I stepped outside, expecting to maybe scare off whatever was poking around. But there was nothing. The woods were still, unnaturally so. I've heard people talk about the calm before a storm, and that's the only way I can describe it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and for the first time in years, I felt exposed. Then I saw it. Between the trees, maybe 50 yards out, something moved. It was big, bigger than anything that should have been in those woods. It was hunched over, long, mangy fur hanging off it like it hadn't eaten in weeks. My first thought was that it was a bear, a sick one maybe. But bears don't walk like that, and they sure as hell don't have legs like a man. I froze, my mind running through every rational explanation it could muster. But there wasn't one. It stood there, not moving, just watching. I don't know how long I stared at it, but it felt like an eternity. Then, in a flash, it bolted, faster than anything that size should be able to move, crashing through the trees like a freight train. My breath hitched, and for the first time in years, I felt furial fear, the kind that makes you realize just how small you are in the grand scheme of things. I backed up slowly, half expecting the thing to charge out of the woods, but nothing happened. The air was still again, and for a second I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the isolation had finally gotten to me. But then came the scream, a high-pitched, gut-wrenching wail that pierced the silence like a knife. It wasn't human, but it wasn't an animal either. It was something else, something wrong, and it was close. Without thinking, I ran back into the garage and grabbed the shotgun I kept behind the workbench. It was old, but it worked, and in that moment, it was the only thing that made me feel even remotely safe. I stood there, staring at the dark woods, waiting for something, anything to happen. Minutes passed, but nothing moved. My hands were shaking, and I felt a bead of sweat run down the back of my neck. That's when I saw it again, closer this time, just on the edge of the tree line, its massive form barely visible in the fading light. My heart pounded in my chest as I raised the shotgun, trying to steady my aim. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I pulled the trigger, the shot echoing through the woods like thunder. The thing staggered back, but it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a guttural snarl, a sound that I'll never forget. It was furious, and I could feel its rage from where I stood. I pumped the shotgun again, but before I could fire, it disappeared into the trees. Not disappeared as in vanished, but it moved so fast I couldn't keep track of it. I stood there, shaking, my mind racing. What the hell was it? I didn't have time to think. In the distance, I heard the sound of something. No, someone. It was a voice, faint and desperate. Someone was out there. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the sound. As I moved deeper into the woods, the voice grew louder. It was a man, and he was begging for help. When I finally found him, I saw why. He was lying on the ground, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "Please," he whispered. "It's still out there." Before I could ask him what had happened, there was a crash behind me. I turned, and there it was again, standing just a few yards away. The thing was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with matted fur and a long, twisted snout. Its body was human-like, but its face was all wrong. It looked like a wolf, but bigger, meaner, and far more intelligent. I didn't hesitate this time. I fired the shotgun again, hitting it square in the chest. It howled in pain and charged at me. I barely had time to move before it was on me, claws slashing at the air, teeth bared. We fought, and I don't know how I survived. Maybe it was adrenaline, or maybe it was dumb luck. But somehow, I managed to get a shot off at point-blank range. The creature stumbled back, finally falling to the ground. I stood there, panting, staring at the thing that had almost killed me. It wasn't moving anymore, but I didn't dare get closer. I turned to help the man, but he was gone. Vanished. Without a trace, just like he'd never been there. I stood in the woods alone again, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. The authorities didn't believe me. They chalked it up to a bear attack, but I know better. The creature was real. Its body stayed where it fell. Proof that whatever I'd faced wasn't a figment of my imagination. When they hauled it away, they gave me a look like I was losing my mind. But I didn't care. I knew what I had seen. Weeks passed, and life slowly went back to normal. But every now and then, I find myself looking out into those woods, half expecting to see something staring back. After all, there's always something bigger lurking out there, something meaner. I just hope I don't run into it again. All right, buckle up, because this ain't your grandma's sleepy small-town story. People always figure places like Knoxdale are just boring backwaters, right? Where the most exciting thing that happens is Mildred McMillan winning the blueberry pie contest at the county fair. Well, let me tell you, after the summer of 2011, I saw things that make your hair stand on end. My name's Bobby Joe B.J. Riggins, and I've been a cop in Knoxdale, Virginia for about 8 years now. Honestly, the town itself ain't much to look at. Less than 20 people, mostly farmers and old folks, rocking on their porches, gossiping about the weather. I joined the force cause, well, a guy's gotta eat, and my old man had been sheriff here for like 100 years. He hung up his hat, tossed me the badge, and that was that. Never really pictured myself as some kind of hero, but hey, it paid the bills, and folks around here respected the badge. Besides, it wasn't like we were dealing with drug cartels or anything. Knoxdale, the most action I'd seen up until that point was a couple of drunk teenagers tipping over mailboxes. But then came June, and things got weird, real weird. It was one of those sticky, humid days where the air feels like a wet blanket, slowing everything down. I was out on my usual patrol, cruising down Old Man Hemlock Road, pretty much the only road that leads out of town. It cuts straight through the woods before winding up towards the mountains. Now, you'd think a road through the woods would be teeming with deer and squirrels and whatnot, but most critters gave Knoxdale a wide berth, except for that day. I'd just passed the old Abernathy farm when I saw something ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer, just standing there in the middle of the road, which, wasn't that unusual. But as I got closer, I realized this thing was way too big for a deer. Its back was all hunched over, legs too long and twisted, like they weren't supposed to bend that way. And its skin. Man, it wasn't fur. It looked like that cracked, leathery hide you see on an elephant, but slick and dark, almost like it was wet. The thing just stood there, frozen like a statue, except for its head, which kept jerking around like it couldn't decide which way to look. I slowed the cruiser down, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. My heart started hammering. It turned its head towards me, and even though I couldn't make out any real features, I felt this icy chill run down my spine. You ever get that feeling where every single cell in your body is screaming at you to get the hell out of there? Yeah, that was it. But being a cop and all, you gotta push past that sometimes. I grabbed the radio. Dispatch. This is Officer Riggins. Got a situation on Old Man Hemlock. Gonna check it out. Roger that, Riggins. You need backup? Negative, I said, even though a part of me wanted to yell. Hell yes. Send everyone you've got. I killed the engine, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. The woods around me were dead silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. It was like the whole place was holding its breath. I called out, "Hey, Get on out of here." The thing twitched, but it didn't budge. I tried again, louder this time, taking a few steps closer. "Come on, get off the road." What happened next is still something I can't fully explain. That thing took off. Fast. It wasn't running like any animal I'd ever seen. Its whole body stretched out, limbs cracking into these weird new shapes as it dropped to all fours and bolted into the trees. The sound of it crashing through the brush was like bones breaking mixed with the crunching of leaves. And just like that, it was gone. I stood there, frozen for a second, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. My brain tried to tell me it was probably just a coyote with mange, or maybe a black bear with some disease that made its fur fall out. But deep down, I knew that was bull. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't normal. I drove back to the station and filed a report, but I left out the part about how it moved and how I felt. No need to give the guys something to rag on me about for the rest of my life. For the next few weeks, things were quiet. Life went back to its slow, boring pace. But I couldn't shake that feeling that something was out there, lurking in the woods. Then the disappearances started. First, it was young Timmy Johnson, about 14, always out hunting with his dad. One morning, his mom calls the station, hysterical, says he didn't come back after going into the woods. We got a search party together. Half the town showed up with flashlights and hunting dogs. I figured the kid probably just wandered off too far, maybe got turned around. People didn't just go missing in Knoxdale. We searched all night, but there was no sign of him. The dogs couldn't pick up any scent, which was weird, because that kid's trail should have been fresh. The next day, we found his hunting rifle, but no blood, no tracks. Nothing to explain where he went. A few days later, an old lady named Agnes Periwinkle lived alone near the edge of town, disappeared too. Same deal. Her door was wide open, lights still on, but she was gone, vanished. The town started buzzing, people whispering about someone snatching folks up, but there was no evidence of anything like that. No signs of a struggle. It was like they just evaporated. Things escalated fast after that. 2 more people went missing, a farmer named Jebediah Tucker and some out-of-towner just passing through on a road trip. The whole town was on edge. People stopped going out at night, locking their doors tight. A few folks even started keeping their guns close. I couldn't stop thinking about that thing I saw on Old Man Hemlock Road. It sounded crazy, but something in me was convinced that whatever was out there was connected to these disappearances. I didn't tell anyone, though. How could I? A cop talking about monsters. That wouldn't go over well. One night I got a call from Hank Wilson. He owned a small ranch just outside of town. Said one of his cows had gone missing. Said he found something strange near the woods. Bones. And not just animal bones either. Human bones, he said. I drove out to his place, the darkness pressing in thick around my headlights. Hank met me at the gate, his face pale, a shotgun in his hands. He led me out to the edge of his property, where the tall grass gave way to a thick line of trees. That's when I saw them. Scattered across the dirt were bones, picked clean. Some were big, some were small, but the shape of them, there was no mistaking it. These weren't animal remains. Jesus, Hank, I muttered, crouching down to get a closer look. Why the hell didn't you call this in sooner? He looked at me, fear in his eyes. Didn't want to believe it, BJ. Didn't want to think something like this was happening here. I couldn't blame him. Part of me didn't want to believe it either. But there they were, real as the dirt under my fingernails. I stood up, scanning the tree line. There was a knot in my stomach, that same feeling I'd had on Old Man Hemlock. I didn't need to be some fancy forensics expert to know what we were dealing with wasn't a person. It was something else, something that hunted. We need to get the hell out of here, I said, my voice low. Hank nodded, gripping his shotgun tighter. But before we could make it back to the house, a low, distant noise reached our ears. Not a howl, more like the deep thrum of something big moving through the underbrush. We both froze. The sound grew louder, coming towards us with unnatural speed. Hank took a step back, his eyes wide with terror. BJ, what the hell is that? I didn't have time to answer. Out of the trees burst that same creature I'd seen weeks earlier. Its grotesque body moving impossibly fast as it charged towards us. Hank fired his shotgun, the blast echoing through the night, but it didn't even slow the thing down. It slammed into him, knocking him to the ground before he could reload. I barely had time to draw my sidearm before the creature lunged at me. I fired off 3 rounds, center mass, before it crumpled to the ground with a sickening thud. My heart was hammering in my chest like a drum solo as I stood over its body, my gun still smoking. Hank lay there, bloody but alive, staring at the creature in disbelief. It looked even more horrifying up close. Its skin was a patchwork of leathery scales and sickly pale patches that looked like a snake's belly. Its long limbs ended in claws that looked like they belonged on some prehistoric beast. Hank let out a shaky breath, his voice barely above a whisper. What the hell is that thing, BJ? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that it wasn't from this world. At least, not the part of the world I knew. The next morning, we called in a team from the state to come investigate the bones and the creature's body. For once, I wasn't the crazy one. They saw it too. And whatever that thing was, it was real enough to scare the hell out of the experts. They took the bones for further analysis, but the body, they left it where it was. Nobody wanted to touch it. A few days later, the disappearances stopped. The town went back to its sleepy routine, but the quiet felt different now, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something else to happen. As for me, I still patrolled the same roads, still pass by Old Man Hemlock every now and then, but now I keep my sidearm a little closer. And when the wind picks up in the trees, I can't help but wonder what's lurking just out of sight. The truth is, I don't care what the experts say. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't the only one. I just know it. And that, my friends, is a whole different kind of scary. When you spend most of your days hunting things that shouldn't even exist, you get used to the silence. Guess it's my way of coping with the job. I'm not much of a talker. Not because I don't like people, but because what's the point of yapping about stuff that doesn't matter? Name's Jack Stratton, and I've been doing this gig long enough to know that when you do talk, it better be damn important. Blackwood Grove, that's where this whole mess went down. Ain't a place you'll find on any map. But trust me, it's real. Tucked away in some godforsaken corner of Northern California, these woods are dense, dark, and old. Older than the damn country itself, some say. Locals whisper about it. The kind of place you avoid unless you got a real good reason to go, and for some reason our unit had to. Orders came down from the top brass, and when that happens, you don't ask questions, you just saddle up and go. I had my doubts about this op from the get-go, not because I was scared. Fear kind of stopped being a thing for me a long time ago, but because it didn't make a lick of sense. See, we hunt cryptids, creatures that ain't supposed to exist but do, and usually we know what we're dealing with before we even get there. But this time, the briefing was vague, even for our standards. Unconfirmed reports of an unidentified creature. That was it. No sightings, no descriptions, just a heads up to be on alert. We were about 4 hours into the trek when the first sign of trouble hit. Wasn't anything big, just a sound, a distant, almost rhythmic thumping. I stopped, held up a hand to the guys, and we all froze. Wasn't wind, wasn't the creak of old trees. It was something else, something alive. I motioned for us to move on, slower this time, keeping our mouths shut. My team was 4 solid guys, each handpicked for their skills. We had Miller, our tracker, leading the way, best damn tracker I'd ever seen. Could read the land like it was an open book. Behind him was Davies, our weapons guy, a walking arsenal. Then there was Hayes, a no-nonsense kind of guy who handled all our tech. And then there was me. They called me the finisher, because I was the one who put things down when they got ugly. As we pushed deeper into the woods, the trees started to change. They weren't just old, they were raw. Bark was cracked and peeling, like skin after a bad sunburn, and the leaves hung limp, all gray and lifeless. The air got thick, humid, and heavy with the smell of rot, even though nothing seemed to be decaying. That thumping sound, it got louder, more insistent, closer. Miller knelt down, inspecting the ground, brushing away a layer of dead leaves. Tracks. He muttered, "But they're messed up, man. Look at this." He pointed to an imprint in the soft earth. A print that looked almost like a dog's, but way too big. The claws were long, longer than any wolf or bear I'd ever seen. "Let's keep moving," I said, not wanting to linger. My voice was steady, but the tension in the air, you could cut it with a knife. The deeper we went, the more wrong everything felt. Birds that should have been chirping were silent. The underbrush, usually teeming with life, was dead still. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting. And that thumping, God, that thumping, it never stopped. We set up camp as the light started to fade, knowing better than to travel these woods after dark. I didn't like the idea of staying out in the open, but we didn't have much choice. As we sat around the small fire, the guys were quiet, and not just because they were tired. Something was off, and we all felt it. "You ever seen anything like this before, Jack?" Davies asked, breaking the silence. I shook my head. "No, and I don't like it one bit. What the hell are we dealing with out here?" Hayes asked, fiddling with his tablet, trying to get a signal that wasn't going to come. "I don't know," I admitted, "but whatever it is, it ain't like anything we've faced before." Miller stood up suddenly, rifle in hand. "Shut up," he hissed. We all went still, listening. The thumping had stopped, for the first time since we entered Blackwood Grove. There was silence, complete and total silence. Then we heard it, a low, rumbling sound, like an engine starting up. But there was no mistaking it. This wasn't mechanical. It was a deep, primal noise, and it was close. "Positions," I barked, and the team jumped into action, forming a tight defensive circle. Weapons drawn, eyes scanning the dark forest around us. The thing came at us fast. We didn't even see it at first, just a blur of movement as it charged out of the undergrowth. Miller fired first, a burst of bullets into the darkness. They hit something solid, and for a moment, there was silence again. Then it lunged into the clearing, and we saw it. The thing was massive, a grotesque mix of muscle and sinew, covered in matted, filthy fur. Its head was long, like a gator's, with a row of jagged teeth that glistened in the firelight. But it moved on 2 legs, hunched over like some unholy cross between a bear and a man. Davies opened up with his shotgun, the blast echoing through the trees. The creature staggered back, but it didn't fall. It let out a scream, an unholy sound that made the air vibrate. It wasn't just a roar of pain, it was pure, unfiltered rage. Hayes threw an incendiary at it. The creature dodged, way faster than something that size should have been able to move. The fireball exploded against a tree, sending sparks raining down on us. It charged again, and this time, it caught Miller, throwing him into a tree with a sickening crunch. The sound of his body breaking was unmistakable. Blood poured from his mouth as he slumped to the ground, unmoving. "Fall back," I shouted. knowing that staying in the clearing was a death sentence. We scrambled back through the trees, but the creature was relentless, its heavy footsteps pounding after us. We didn't make it far. Hayes tripped over a root, and the creature was on him before he could get up. I didn't see what it did to him, but the scream he let out told me more than enough. Davies and I kept running, the sounds of pursuit close behind. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the chase stopped. The creature was gone, disappearing into the blackness as quickly as it had appeared. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the woods, where our extraction point was supposed to be. But there was no sign of a chopper, no sign of our backup, just more silence. Davies collapsed to his knees, panting heavily, his face pale. "What the hell was that thing?" he gasped. I didn't have an answer. "We need to find Miller and Hayes," I said. Even though I knew it was a lie, there was no finding them, not alive, anyway. We waited for hours, but no help came. Eventually, we started back toward the site where Miller had gone down. The forest seemed darker now, more oppressive. Every shadow looked like it was hiding something monstrous, but I had to find out if there was anything left of my men. When we reached the clearing, the fire had burned out, leaving only embers. Miller's body was there, twisted and broken, but intact. Hayes's gear was scattered, blood splattered across the leaves, but his body was gone. Where the hell did it go? Davies whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, "but we're getting out of here now." We didn't run this time, we walked, guns drawn, every muscle tensed for the slightest sound, the slightest movement. But the creature didn't come back, not then. By the time we reached the rendezvous point again, the chopper had finally arrived. We climbed in without a word, and I could tell the pilot knew better than to ask questions. As the chopper lifted off, I looked back at the dark line of trees that marked the edge of Blackwood Grove. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there. Davies and I never spoke about what happened again. There was no need. The silence said it all. As for me, well, I don't sleep much these days, and I don't go near the woods, not 'cause I'm scared. Fear stopped being a thing for me years ago, but because there's nothing left to say. Some things you just leave behind, and some things they just don't need words. My head was practically buzzing from boredom on patrol that day when dispatch finally crackled through, something weird enough to jolt me awake. I'd been a cop in this sleepy little town, Harmony Creek, Nebraska, for 5 years. Quiet place, only a few hundred folks. The kind of town where the most exciting thing I usually dealt with was some local getting a little too tipsy at the Rusty Mug, or a cow busting loose from one of the nearby farms. It was 2003, the kind of year where nothing much happened, and honestly, that suited me just fine. My name's Dale, nothing flashy, just your average small-town cop with a halfway decent sense of humor and a bad habit of pounding down too many donuts. You'd like me, though. Everyone in town does. We look out for each other, mostly 'cause we're all we've got. Nothing big ever happens here. That's why when dispatch radioed about some hiker going missing out near the old cattle trails north of town, I didn't think much of it. Just another city slicker getting turned around. Probably took a wrong turn or wasn't paying attention to the markers. Happens more often than you'd think. People come through expecting to hike in the Great Plains like they're on some grand adventure, then realize they have no clue where they are. I grabbed my radio and called it in. "Dale, here. I'll go check it out. Any details?" The voice on the other end crackled. "Some guy named Ethan Hayes. His wife says he went hiking early this morning and hasn't come back. She's been waiting at the car for hours." "Copy that. I'm on my way." I grumbled to myself, already picturing some dude in cargo shorts and a sunburn, wandering in circles with his GPS telling him he's in Kansas or something. The old cattle trail wasn't far, just about a 20-minute drive, mostly dirt roads. When I got there, I saw an old, beat-up SUV parked by the trailhead. A woman was sitting on the hood, looking nervous, and the sun was already getting low. She waved me down before I even got out of the cruiser. "Officer, officer," she called out almost frantically. "Ma'am," I nodded as I approached. "You're Mrs. Hayes?" She nodded, biting her lip. "Yeah, Ethan's been gone for hours. He left at 6 this morning, said he was going to check out the old trail and come back by noon, but he hasn't. I tried calling, but there's no signal out here. I'm worried something happened." I nodded, trying to reassure her while feeling the familiar drag of a long day coming. "It's probably nothing. People get turned around out here all the time. I'll go check the trail, see if I can find him. You stay here in case he shows up." She looked like she was about to protest, but I gave her a nod, and she stayed put. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down the trail. It wasn't much, mostly overgrown, and the markers were faded. If Ethan wasn't paying attention, I could see how he might have gotten off track. Hell, even I felt a little uneasy walking the path. It was too quiet. Not even the wind stirred the grass, which was weird for Nebraska. As I moved deeper into the woods, something felt off. You ever get that feeling like someone's watching you, even though you're sure you're alone? Yeah, it was like that. I tried shaking it off, blaming it on the setting sun casting weird shadows through the trees, but that tight feeling in my chest didn't go away. After about an hour of walking, I still hadn't found any sign of Ethan. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. It was as if he'd never been here. That's when I heard it. A low, almost rumbling sound. Not quite animal, not quite human, just off. I froze, ears straining to pinpoint where it came from. The sound came again, this time closer. Something was moving in the brush ahead of me, slow and deliberate, like it was waiting for me to notice. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and flicked it in the direction of the noise, and then I saw it. At first, I thought it was some kind of deformed elk or maybe a sick bear. It was crouched low, moving on all fours, but its limbs were too long, too thin, and the way it moved was unnatural, jerky, like it didn't quite know how. Its skin was grayish, hanging off its body like wet leather. Its face, God, its face. It had no lips, just exposed, gnashing teeth, and the nose was all wrong, flat and rotted, as if it had been eaten away by something. I'm not ashamed to admit that I stepped back, fast. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't something I was equipped to handle, not with just a flashlight and some handcuffs. The creature's head jerked up, and it locked onto me. It had no eyelids, just black, glossy orbs that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. I heard it again, that same low, guttural noise, like it was laughing at me. My stomach dropped, and I bolted. Now, I'm not a runner. Hell, I avoid the gym like it's the plague. But in that moment, I was Usain Bolt. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, not stopping to look back, my breath coming in harsh gasps. The trees blurred around me, and the path seemed to twist and narrow with every step. But I kept running, knowing full well that stopping meant I wouldn't be going home. I could hear it behind me, the rustling in the brush, its uneven footsteps gaining on me. I veered off the trail, crashing through the underbrush, hoping I could lose it in the thicket. The sky was nearly dark now, and my flashlight was useless, bobbing and swinging wildly as I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just away. But I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. My legs were burning, my lungs on fire. I stumbled into a small clearing, gasping for air, and that's when I saw the body. Ethan Hayes, or what was left of him. His torso was half-eaten, ribs exposed like a gutted deer. His face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, his eyes wide open, staring up at nothing. I gagged, bile rising in my throat. This was worse than anything I'd ever seen before. Worse than the crime scene photos they showed us in training. No human could have done that. I didn't have time to process what I was seeing before the sound came again, closer this time. I whipped around and there it was, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me, teeth bared in a sick parody of a grin. I was trapped. My brain went into overdrive, thinking of ways out, but there was nothing. No gun, no backup, just me and this thing. My only chance was to distract it, maybe get it to chase something else. I did the stupidest thing I could think of. I threw my flashlight at it. It hit the creature square in the chest, bouncing off with a dull thud. For a second, it didn't move. Then it snarled, a horrible, wheezing sound, and charged. I ducked to the side just in time, feeling the rush of air as it barreled past me. It skidded to a stop, its claws digging into the dirt, and turned, ready to come at me again. But I didn't give it the chance. I took off, sprinting into the trees, my only goal to make it back to the trail, to my cruiser, to anywhere but here. It was right behind me again, its breath rasping, its footsteps slamming into the earth, faster than before. I could feel it closing in, and I knew I wasn't going to make it. I was too slow, too out of shape. Then I heard a gunshot, a loud, echoing crack that split the night air. The creature screeched, a horrible, piercing sound, and I saw it stumble. Another shot followed, and this time it fell, crashing to the ground just a few feet behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead, where Mrs. Hayes was still waiting by the SUV. She stood up when she saw me, eyes wide. "Ethan?" she asked, her voice trembling. I shook my head. "I'm sorry, he's gone." She crumpled to the ground, sobbing, but I didn't have time to console her. I turned back to the trail where the thing had fallen. There was a figure standing over the body, holding a rifle. As I approached, I saw it was old Jebediah, the town recluse who lived in a cabin way out in the woods. He looked down at the creature, then back at me. His face was grim, lined with years of hard living. "That thing," he said, spitting on the ground, "ain't the first I've seen, won't be the last either." I stared at him, dumbfounded. "What the hell is..." Jebediah shook his head. "Been around these parts long before us. They come and go, but they always take something with them." I looked down at the creature's body, still twitching in the dirt, its black, lifeless eyes staring up at the sky. I didn't stick around to find out more. I had to get back to town, had to warn people. Had to, I didn't know what, but one thing was for sure. Harmony Creek wasn't so harmonious anymore. I never thought I'd end up in this mess. Hell, I didn't even want to leave New Orleans, but things get complicated when you owe money to the wrong people. Guess living off the grid sounded like a good idea after I found myself staring down a couple of guys who thought breaking fingers was a fine way to start a conversation. That's how I ended up in these woods. This happened back in 2003, in some forgotten pocket of Oregon. Name's Ethan Hayes, by the way. Don't bother looking me up. I haven't existed in the system since I ditched my old life. Now, I'm not some tree-hugging survivalist. Far from it. If you'd told me 5 years ago that I'd be chopping wood and making my own food, I would have laughed and handed you a drink. But life's funny that way. You take a wrong turn here, make a bad bet there, and suddenly you're learning how to catch fish with your hands because you're too cheap to buy a rod. I've been up here for about 8 months, living in a broken-down cabin I bought from an old coot who swore it was fixer-upper material. The guy must have had a sense of humor because this place was falling apart before I even got the keys. Every morning started with something needing repair, and by evening I'd managed to keep it from collapsing one more day. One thing I loved about this off-the-grid life: no neighbors. I didn't have to answer to anyone, just me, the trees, and maybe a squirrel or two. That was until my buddy Ben showed up unannounced. Ben was the only guy from my old life I trusted not to rat me out. He liked to say he came from street stock, like me, Real stand-up guy. Loyal, but not too bright. So when he came knocking on my door with some beers, I figured we'd shoot the breeze and forget about our problems for a while. But that night, things took a turn. We were sitting outside, looking up at the sky. No light pollution out here, so the stars were like something out of a painting. We got to talking about old times, trading the usual trash talk, and then it happened. At first, I thought it was just a deer. A rustling in the woods behind the cabin, no big deal. Deer are everywhere out here. But then Ben, who was halfway through telling a dumb joke about a bartender and a duck, stopped cold. His eyes got wide, and he set his beer down like it had turned to poison. "Ethan," he whispered, "what the hell is that?" I turned my head and saw it. This thing moving between the trees. At first I couldn't make out what it was. Looked like a big dog, but it moved wrong, kind of sideways like it wasn't built right. Now, I've seen my fair share of messed up animals out here. Hell, some of them look like they got built by committee, but this was different. It wasn't the size that got me. It was the way it moved, like it didn't care if we saw it, almost like it wanted us to. I tried to laugh it off. "Probably just a wolf," I said. "They got those around here, don't they?" Ben shook his head. "That's no wolf." I stood up, grabbed the old flashlight I kept by the door, and pointed it in the direction of the noise. I wasn't about to let some mangy animal ruin my night. The light cut through the trees, but whatever it was stayed just out of reach. I caught a glimpse of its legs. Long, too long for anything normal. I clicked the flashlight off. No sense wasting batteries on something that didn't seem interested in us. But that wasn't the end of it. We went back inside, locked the doors, and laughed it off. But neither of us slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear that same rustling, closer this time. Around 3 a.m, I got up, looked out the window, and saw nothing but trees and shadows. Maybe I was being paranoid, but something felt wrong. Ben was still awake, staring at the ceiling like he was waiting for something to come crashing through the roof. "Man, we need to get out of here," Ben said, breaking the silence. "Whatever that was, it ain't right." "Relax," I said, trying to sound tough. "It's probably gone by now." But I didn't believe it. Not for a second. The next morning, we both agreed to check out the area where we'd seen the thing. Armed with nothing but a rusty axe and a hunting knife, we walked deeper into the wood. Ben kept muttering about how dumb this was, and I couldn't argue with him. But something kept pulling me in. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the fact that I didn't like feeling scared in my own damn woods. The deeper we went, the quieter the forest got. No birds, no bugs, just dead silent. I started to think that maybe we should turn back when Ben froze again, pointing ahead. "There," he whispered. I saw it, a pile of bones, fresh, too. Something had ripped apart a deer, but it wasn't like any predator I'd ever seen. The bones were broken, not chewed, just shattered, like someone had stomped on them. And the weirdest part, there was no blood. Ben didn't need to say anything. We both knew something was off, and it was time to get the hell out of there. But as we turned to leave, I heard it again, that same rustling sound from the night before. Except this time it wasn't hiding, it was coming straight for us. We ran. And I don't mean we jogged back like idiots who thought we were being followed. I mean we ran like our lives depended on it, because they did. I could hear it behind us, crashing through the underbrush like it wasn't trying to be stealthy anymore. Whatever it was fast, and it was angry. Ben was ahead of me, breathing hard, when I saw him trip. He hit the ground hard, and I turned back, grabbing him by the arm. "Get up, man." But before I could pull him to his feet, I saw it. Finally, out in the open. It looked like a dog, but its back legs were bent wrong, like a goat. Its skin was patchy, fur missing in spots. But what really got me was the smell, rotten like a carcass that had been baking in the sun for days. It was on Ben before I could blink, knocking him down again. I saw its jaws snap down on his shoulder, tearing into him like he was made of paper. Blood sprayed everywhere, and Ben screamed, a horrible, gut-wrenching sound that made me sick. I wasn't armed, not even a gun. And even if I had one, what would I do? This thing wasn't natural. But I couldn't just stand there. So I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a rock and hurled it at the thing's head. It bounced off harmlessly, but it was enough to make it let go of Ben for a second. I dragged him to his feet, and we kept running. By some miracle, we made it back to the cabin. Ben was bleeding out, his shirt soaked with blood. But we had to keep going. I threw open the door, shoved him inside, and slammed it shut. We pushed everything we could find in front of the door. Chairs, tables, anything that might slow it down for a while. It was quiet. I sat there, holding my breath, waiting for it to come crashing through the door. Ben was fading fast. He was slumped against the wall, breathing shallow, and I didn't know what to do. I'm no doctor, and we were miles away from any kind of help. Then the banging started. Slow at first, like it was testing the walls, seeing how much force it needed. Each thud sent chills down my spine. No, not chills. That's too cliché for what I felt. It was more like I was watching my life fall apart, brick by brick, knowing there was nothing I could do to stop it. Ben groaned, barely conscious now. I grabbed a rag and tried to stop the bleeding, but it was useless. He was already too far gone. I'm sorry, man, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if he could hear me. I'm so damn sorry. Then the door buckled, the wood cracked, and I knew we were done. I backed up, holding the knife like it was going to do something. But when the door finally gave way, it wasn't the thing that stepped through. It was a man, or at least what was left of one. His skin was pale, stretched tight over bones, and his eyes, well, let's just say they didn't look human anymore. He didn't say a word, just looked at me like I was the next meal on the menu. Behind him, I could see more figures in the woods, waiting. It wasn't just one thing, it was a pack. They had been watching us the whole time, hunting us like animals. I don't know how I made it out. Maybe they were toying with me, letting me think I had a chance. Or maybe I just got lucky. But I ran. I left Ben behind, left the cabin behind, and didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. Ben didn't make it, obviously. By the time anyone believed my story enough to send help, there wasn't much left of him to find. Just bones, broken and scattered like the deer we'd seen earlier. And the thing that got him? It didn't vanish. They found its body, twisted and mangled in a way that didn't make sense. Maybe it was just an animal, something freakish and mutated by nature. Or maybe it was something else, something no one wants to admit exists. All I know is, I'm not going back to those woods. I never thought I'd find myself cruising through Kentucky in 4, let alone on some backwoods road Google Maps wouldn't even recognize today. But there I was, weaving through endless trees and hills, trying to make it to a fishing trip I had planned with my buddy Dale, who lived out in Somerset. My name is Mark Sanders, and if you ever find yourself out that way, don't make the same mistake I did. Don't take a shortcut through the hills. I was coming off a job in Lexington, nothing special, just some consulting work. I'm a freelance contractor, so I usually pick up small gigs wherever they pop up. The work's steady, though, and it pays for things like the boat I bought last summer and the cabin I've been meaning to fix up. But that weekend, it was supposed to be all about fishing, a cooler full of beer and some serious time away from people. I needed it. The last few months had been a real grind, and my nerves were shot. Dale was the only person I could stand to be around right now. The trip started off smooth enough. I tossed my bag in the back of my truck, filled up the tank, and left Lexington mid-afternoon. The weather was cool, perfect for a weekend outdoors. But then, somewhere past Danville, my GPS went haywire. No service, no signal, nothing. I cursed, pulled over, and stared at the map on my phone like an idiot. Dale had told me to take the scenic route, but I must have missed a turn somewhere. Typical. I figured I'd just keep going and hit a main road eventually, right? Wrong. I don't know when I realized I was lost. The road started winding tighter, the trees closing in on both sides like a tunnel. The pavement turned to gravel, then dirt. The hills got steeper, and the forest felt thick, like it was swallowing me whole. No houses, no signs, nothing. I should have turned around, but I'm stubborn like that. Besides, I wasn't scared. Not yet. It wasn't until the sun dipped low behind the hills that I started to feel uneasy. The headlights bounced off the thick trees as I drove slower and slower, trying to make sense of the narrowing path. And then I saw it, an old, weathered wooden sign, half covered in moss. Turner's Hollow, next left. I shrugged, figuring it was better than driving blind, and took the turn. Big mistake. The road narrowed even more, if you could call it a road, more like two muddy tracks. The trees were so dense I could barely see the sky, and the shadows. They were long and deep, like black curtains draped over everything. I told myself it was just the fading light playing tricks, but something felt wrong. It wasn't just the isolation or the fact that I hadn't seen a car for hours. There was something in the air, something heavy. I kept driving, telling myself it would open up soon. It didn't. Instead, I found myself in front of an old house, if you could call it that. The place looked abandoned, but I knew better. It wasn't the kind of abandoned where nature reclaims it. No, this was worse. The house sagged like it had been neglected for decades. The windows were dark, but I could feel something, or someone, watching. The kind of place that sends chills up your spine. I cut the engine and stared. I don't know why. Maybe I thought someone could help me find my way. Maybe I was just curious. Whatever it was, I regret it. I got out of the truck and approached the house. The air was thick with the smell of rot, like something had died nearby and had been left to decay. My boots squelched in the mud as I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under my weight. I knocked. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time, and the door swung open with a groan. I called out, but there was no response. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The interior was worse than the outside, dusty, musty, and filled with strange, homemade furniture. I could hear something faint, like a radio playing, from a room deeper inside the house. The floorboards creaked with each step as I moved through the hallway, past dimly lit rooms filled with broken down furniture. Everything was off, too quiet, too still. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling coming from upstairs, the sound of feet shuffling, like someone moving around but trying not to be heard. I froze, every instinct telling me to leave. But I didn't. Instead, I crept toward the staircase, listening. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the house itself was alive, breathing in the dark. I was halfway up the stairs when the door at the top creaked open. For a split second, I saw a figure, a man, or something close enough. He looked wild, filthy, his clothes tattered. His eyes, no, I can't even explain it. They were hollow, staring right through me, and then he was gone, darting into the shadows like an animal. I bolted, no hesitation, no second guessing. I ran back to the truck, heart pounding, and slammed the door shut, fumbling to start the engine. As the truck roared to life, I glanced back at the house. There were more of them now, people or something like them, standing at the windows, watching. I gunned it, tearing down the dirt road, the truck bouncing and rattling like it was going to fall apart. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. But the road kept twisting, leading me deeper into the woods. Every turn felt like a trap, and the trees seemed to close in tighter as if they were pushing me back toward that house. That's when I saw the second sign, "Keep out." Too late for that. I pressed harder on the gas, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. When suddenly, Out of nowhere, something slammed into the truck. I lost control, skidding into a ditch, the tires spinning uselessly in the mud. Before I could react, they were on me. 3, maybe 4 of them. Men, but not like any men I'd ever seen. Their faces were twisted, misshapen, their skin filthy and scarred. They wore ragged clothes, nothing but torn-up shirts and pants, some with no shoes. They yanked the door open, grabbing at me, pulling me out of the truck. I fought back, throwing punches, kicking, but it was no use. They were strong, freakishly strong, and there was no reasoning with them. They dragged me toward the house, my boots scraping the mud as I tried to dig in. One of them muttered something under his breath, but it wasn't a language I recognized. It was garbled, like an animal trying to mimic speech. They brought me inside, back through the house and down into a basement that stank of mildew and blood. The walls were covered in strange carvings, symbols I didn't understand, like twisted shapes burned into the wood. I struggled, tried to pull free, but they were too strong. I was tossed into a corner, my head hitting something hard, something metal. I tasted blood and felt the world spinning as they talked to each other in that same garbled, broken language. I thought that was it. I thought I was dead. But instead, they left. They left me alone, locked in that basement, with the sounds of something dripping. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to figure out how to escape. But eventually, I heard something upstairs. A voice, maybe? No, it was singing, a woman's voice, soft and distant. Then, a sharp knock echoed through the floorboards. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. I stood up, dizzy but determined. Feeling around the basement, my hands hit metal chains. I pulled on them, realizing they were attached to the floor. And then I heard it again, the singing. It was closer this time, right above me, and I felt the floorboards tremble beneath my feet. I didn't wait to find out what was coming. I yanked harder on the chains, feeling them loosen just enough for me to pull one free. It wasn't much, but it was something. I could hear footsteps upstairs now, multiple sets. I had no plan, no way out, but I wasn't going down without a fight. They came back, 3 of them, the same men, or whatever they were who had dragged me here. This time, though, they weren't alone. Behind them, walking slowly, was a woman. She was tall, thin, her hair tangled and matted, her face twisted in a way that made her look inhuman. But it wasn't her appearance that froze me. It was her eyes, or the lack of anything behind them. They said something to her, a few guttural sounds, and she nodded, stepping toward me with a knife in her hand. It was old, rusted, and covered in something dark. I backed up, feeling the cold stone of the wall behind me, gripping the loose chain like it was a lifeline. Just as she raised the knife, I swung the chain, catching her arm. She screamed, a high-pitched wail that echoed through the basement, and stumbled back. The other men lunged at me, but I was faster. I scrambled out of the corner, the chain still in my hand, and swung again, hitting one of them in the head. He dropped like a sack of bricks, his skull making a sickening crack against the floor. The others hesitated for a moment, enough time for me to get some distance between them and myself. My heart pounded in my ears, but there was no time to think. I had to get out, had to escape, or I was done for. The woman with the knife shrieked again, lunging toward me, but I swung the chain wildly, keeping her at bay. I backed up toward the door that led upstairs, my mind racing. There was no way I could take them all on, but if I could get out of the basement, I had a chance. I bolted for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, the wooden steps groaning under my weight. I could hear the others behind me, their footsteps heavy and erratic, but I didn't look back. I couldn't, not if I wanted to live. Bursting through the basement door, I found myself in the same decaying hallway, but now it felt like a labyrinth. I had no idea where the front door was. The house seemed to shift around me, every turn leading me deeper into the twisted nightmare. I ran through room after room, each more decrepit than the last, filled with rotting furniture and things I couldn't begin to describe. My breaths were shallow, panic clawing at my chest, but I couldn't stop, not now. I finally found a door, one that I hoped led outside. I yanked it open, only to be met with a burst of cold air. Relief washed over me until I saw them. 3 more figures were standing just outside, their silhouettes barely visible in the twilight. They were waiting for me. Before I could react, one of them lunged at me, his filthy hands reaching for my throat. I ducked just in time, slamming the door in his face and locking it. My hand shook, adrenaline surging through my veins, but I knew the door wouldn't hold for long. I needed another way out. Frantically, I scanned the room, a kitchen, by the looks of it. An old stove, a rusted sink, broken dishes scattered across the floor. And then I saw it, a small window, half covered in grime. It was my only chance. I grabbed a chair and smashed it against the window, shattering the glass. Without thinking, I hauled myself through the opening, scraping my arms and legs on the jagged edges. But I didn't care. I was outside. I was free, or so I thought. The second I hit the ground, something hard slammed into me, knocking the wind from my lungs. I gasped for air as I was dragged into the dirt. One of them had been waiting, hidden in the bushes. His grip was like iron, pulling me toward the tree line. I kicked, punched, screamed, anything to break free, but he was too strong. Just when I thought it was over, a loud crack echoed through the air. The man, or whatever he was, let go, crumbling to the ground. I looked up, dazed, and saw a figure standing just beyond the clearing, a man with a shotgun. "Get up," he barked. Now. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled to my feet and ran toward him, my legs weak, my mind racing. The man fired another shot, sending another one of the cannibals retreating into the woods. "Who the hell are you?" I gasped, barely able to catch my breath. "Doesn't matter," he said gruffly, his eyes scanning the tree line. "But you better thank your lucky stars I was out hunting tonight." He gestured for me to follow him, and we took off into the wood. My body was running on pure adrenaline at this point, my mind too overwhelmed to process what had just happened. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. I couldn't. We ran for what felt like hours, deeper into the forest, the sound of distant howls and footsteps echoing behind us. The man led the way, navigating the dense brush with ease, while I stumbled along behind him, my body aching from the struggle. Finally, we reached a small cabin, his, I assumed. He unlocked the door, shoved me inside, and bolted it shut behind it. "They won't come here," he muttered, tossing his shotgun onto the table. "Not now." I collapsed onto the nearest chair, my head spinning. My entire body hurt, but I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I had made it out. I looked over at the man who had saved me. He was older, grizzled, with deep lines etched into his face. His clothes were worn, and he moved with the kind of slow deliberation that came from years of hard living. What the hell were those things?" I asked, still trying to catch my breath. He glanced at me, his expression grim. "People, or they used to be. Inbred folk, been living out here for generations. Ain't right in the head, any of them. Dangerous as hell." I shuddered, the weight of what had just happened finally sinking in. "Why didn't you just leave?" He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Where would I go? This is home. I know how to handle myself out here, and now you do too." I didn't know what to say. I was alive because of this man, but I wasn't sure if I was grateful or just terrified. My mind raced with questions. How long had those cannibals been out there? How many more why the hell had I taken that stupid shortcut in the first place? But I didn't get the chance to ask. Before I could say anything else, the man stood up and grabbed his shotgun again. "Get some rest," he said. "We'll head out at first light. I'll get you to the main road." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I'd be able to sleep, not after everything I'd seen. Still, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the cracked ceiling of the cabin, my mind racing. But just as I was starting to relax, I heard it, a knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the cabin door. My heart stopped. I shot a glance at the man, but his face was unreadable. He didn't move, didn't react. The knock came again, louder this time. "Don't answer it," he whispered, his voice low and tense. "Whatever you do, don't answer." I froze, fear crawling up my spine. The knock came again, more insistent. I didn't know what to do, didn't know who or what was out there, but I wasn't about to open that door. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. We sat in silence, the tension thick in the air. After a few moments, the man stood up, walking slowly toward the window. He peeked outside, his expression grim. "They're out there," he said quietly, "watching." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What do we do?" He looked at me, his eyes dark and serious. "We wait. And we hope they don't try to get in." I didn't sleep that night. I sat there in that creaky old cabin, listening to the sounds of the forest, every snap of a twig making me jump. The man sat across from me, his shotgun resting on his lap, his eyes never leaving the door. Morning came slowly, the first rays of light filtering through the dirty window. The man finally stood up, stretching his stiff limbs. "We made it," he said, his voice hoarse. "Let's get you out of here." I nodded, my body aching from the tension of the night. We packed up quick, and within minutes we were back on the trail, heading toward the main road. The forest was eerily quiet, as if nothing had happened, but I knew better. We walked in silence for a while, the man leading the way, his shotgun slung over his shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, but every time I looked back, the woods were empty. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached a clearing. I could see the road in the distance, my truck still sitting where I had left it. Relief washed over me. "I'll be fine from here," I said, turning to the man. "Thanks for everything." He nodded, his face unreadable. "Be careful out there." I climbed into my truck, the engine sputtering to life. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced back one last time. The man was gone, just the trees stretching out endlessly. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know more. I drove straight to Somerset, met Dale, and pretended nothing had happened. But every now and then, when I close my eyes, I hear those knocks, 3 slow, deliberate knocks, and I wonder if they ever stop.